The Devil's Bargain. When a gunslinger found God in the desert. Reed Callahan had killed 17 men before his 30th birthday. But nothing prepared him for the sound that would haunt him forever, the desperate cries of two infants beneath their mother's cooling body in the New Mexico wasteland of 1876. Some men find redemption in whiskey, others in prayer. Reed found his in two tiny heartbeats against a blood-soaked dress. This is the story of how a killer became a father and how love arrived on the wind of a woman's lullaby. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert had a way of swallowing secrets whole, burying them beneath layers of sand and silence where no God-fearing man would ever think to look. Reed Callahan understood this better than most. He'd spent the better part of a decade making things disappear. Men, mostly, the kind whose names appeared on wanted posters and whose deaths earned him enough coin to keep riding, keep moving, keep running from whatever version of himself he'd left bleeding in the last town. The New Mexico Territory in 1876 wasn't a place for the weak or the sentimental. It was a land of scorpions and sage, where the sun beat down with biblical fury and the nights dropped cold enough to freeze the marrow in your bones. It was a place where a man could reinvent himself as many times as he had bullets, where the past stayed buried as long as you kept your mouth shut and your gun clean. Reed had been riding for 3 days straight when he first smelled the smoke. It wasn't the good kind of smoke, not campfire or cook fire, not the warm, inviting smell of civilization pushing back against the wilderness. This was the acrid, throat-closing stench of destruction, of wood and flesh and dreams all burning together in a pyre of violence that Reed had seen too many times before. His horse, a gray mare named Ash for the color of her coat and the color of everything Reed seemed to touch, whickered nervously beneath him, picking up on the scent of death that even the desert wind couldn't fully carry away. "Easy, girl," Reed murmured, his voice rough from days without much use. He wasn't a man given to unnecessary words, not anymore. There'd been a time, years back, when he'd been different, when he'd laughed easy and loved easier, when he'd believed the world was something other than a vast expanse of cruelty, interrupted by brief moments of mercy. But that man had died along with Sarah, and the baby she'd been carrying had died in a cabin fire while Reed was 3 towns over, chasing bounty money he'd thought would build them a better life. The irony wasn't lost on him. It never was. He urged Ash forward, following the smoke column that rose like a dark prayer into the cloudless sky. Part of him, the part that had learned survival meant minding your own business, said to turn around, to let whatever tragedy had unfolded here remain someone else's burden. But there was another part, a smaller part, that refused to die no matter how much whiskey he poured on it, that needed to know, needed to see, needed to count the cost of whatever evil had passed through here like a flash flood through an arroyo. The homestead came into view gradually, the way most things did in the desert. First, a shimmer of possibility, then the hard reality of stone and wood, and finally the devastating totality of what remained, which wasn't much. The main house was a smoking skeleton, its adobe walls cracked and blackened, its roof timbers collapsed inward like broken ribs. The barn had fared slightly better, though its doors hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Scattered around the property were the smaller markers of violence, overturned wagons, scattered belongings, and the dark shapes that Reed's eyes wanted to skip over but his conscience wouldn't allow. Bodies. 4 of them that he could see from his vantage point on the low ridge overlooking the property. 5 if you counted the one half buried in the collapsed doorway of the house. Reed sat there for a long moment, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes, looking for any sign that the raiders, and he knew it was raiders, probably Comanche or renegade Apache, judging by the arrow shafts he could make out even from this distance, might still be nearby. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the buzzards beginning their slow, patient circles overhead. "Damn it," Reed said softly, and the words felt like a prayer even though he'd stopped believing in anyone listening a long time ago. He clicked his tongue and guided Ash down the slope, his right hand resting easy on the Colt 45 at his hip. Not because he expected trouble, whatever had happened here was hours old, maybe a full day, but because some habits were too ingrained to break. He'd learned young that the difference between dying and living often came down to nothing more than half a second and whether your hand was already moving when you needed it to be. The smell hit him properly when he reached the yard, that particular combination of burned wood, spilled blood, and loosened bowels that marked violent death. Reed had smelled it before, more times than he could count, but familiarity didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it worse, because now he knew exactly what he'd find when he started looking. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements quiet despite the abandonment all around him. The first body was a man, maybe 40 years old, with the weathered face and work-hardened hands of a homesteader who'd been trying to carve something permanent out of this unforgiving land. He'd been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. Professional, efficient. The kind of killing that spoke of experienced raiders, not young warriors looking to prove their courage. Reed moved through the yard methodically, checking each body, saying a silent word over each one, even though he didn't know their names and never would. An older woman, the man's mother perhaps, or an aunt, who'd been struck down near the well, a bucket still clutched in her stiffening fingers. Two younger men, brothers by the look of them, who'd made a stand near the barn and had died fighting, their rifles empty beside them. And then, in the doorway of the ruined house, partially buried under a fallen beam, he found her. She was young, couldn't have been more than 25, with long dark hair that had come loose from its pins and spread around her head like a dark halo. She'd been beautiful, Reed could tell, before the fear and the pain had twisted her features into their final expression. She'd been shot in the back, probably while trying to run inside, to get to whatever she'd been protecting in the house's interior. Reed's throat tightened. He'd seen pregnant women killed before, had seen children murdered, had witnessed every variation of human cruelty that the frontier had to offer. But somehow, it never got easier. Shouldn't get easier, he thought. The day it does is the day I put my gun in my mouth and pull the trigger. He was about to turn away, to start the grim work of dragging the bodies together for a proper burial, when he heard it. A sound so faint, so impossible in the midst of all this death, that for a moment Reed thought he'd imagined it. But then it came again, a little stronger this time, and his heart, that organ he'd thought had calcified years ago, suddenly kicked hard against his ribs. Crying. Not the wailing of an older child, but the wet, desperate mewling of an infant. Maybe two infants, harmonizing in that universal language of hunger and fear and desperate, helpless need. Jesus Christ, Reed breathed, and this time it definitely was a prayer. He moved without thinking, his hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted the beam pinning the woman's body. The wood was still warm from the fire, and it left black smears across his palms as he heaved it aside. Beneath her, protected by her body in those final moments, were two bundles wrapped in scorched fabric. Babies. Twins, by the look of them. One slightly larger than the other, both with that angry red color that newborns got when they'd been crying too long and too hard. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, maybe a month at the outside. Reed stared at them, his mind momentarily blank with shock, with the sheer impossible survival of it all. The woman had thrown herself over them when the raiders came, had taken the bullet meant for them, had let herself burn rather than move away, had used her body as a shield until the very end. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. The babies were alive. Reed knelt there in the ashes and the blood, these two tiny squirming lives in his hands, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been sealed tight since the day he'd found Sarah's body, since the day he'd decided that the world was too cruel and too random for anything like love or hope to survive. "Well," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "Well, hell." The larger baby, a boy, Reed discovered when he unwrapped the cloth enough to check, had stopped crying and was now staring up at him with those unfocused newborn eyes, his tiny fists waving in the air like he was fighting invisible demons. The smaller one, a girl, with a tuft of dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat and smoke, was still fussing, her face screwed up in infant rage and indignation at the indignity of being born into a world that had immediately tried to kill her. "I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do with you," Reed said, and the boy made a sound that might have been agreement. But even as he said it, even as his mind raced through possibilities and practicalities and the thousand ways this could go wrong, Reed knew what he was going to do. what he had to do. Because leaving them here wasn't an option, not with the buzzards circling and the coyotes that would come at nightfall, and riding to the nearest town to hand them off to whatever passed for authority in this godforsaken territory would take days. Days these babies probably didn't have, not without milk and care and someone who knew what they were doing, which meant he was taking them with him, somehow. A man who'd spent the last decade killing for money was now responsible for keeping two helpless infants alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. God has a sense of humor, Reed muttered, gathering the babies carefully, trying to remember everything Sarah had told him about how to hold a baby, how to support the head, how to keep them safe. A twisted, cruel sense of humor. But as he stood there, these two tiny lives against his chest, feeling their heartbeats through the layers of cloth and skin, Reed made a promise. The same promise he'd made to Sarah all those years ago. The promise he'd failed to keep. "You're going to make it, little ones," he said quietly, his voice fierce with determination even as his hands shook with uncertainty. "I don't know how, and I don't know where we're going, but you're going to make it, I promise." The next few hours passed in a blur of grim necessity. Reed worked fast, trying to block out the reality of what he was doing as he prepared to leave. He couldn't bury them properly. Not all of them, not alone, not with two babies to care for. So he did what he could. He pulled the bodies together in the yard, said what words came to him from half-remembered church services his mother had dragged him to as a boy, and covered them with whatever stones he could find. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. Before he left, Reed searched the ruins of the house, looking for anything that might help keep the babies alive. He found a satchel with some intact supplies, a few jars of what looked like mashed vegetables, some clean cloth that could serve as diapers, a tin cup that he could maybe use to feed them. In what must have been the bedroom, miraculously untouched by the fire, he found a leather journal filled with a woman's careful handwriting. Reed couldn't bring himself to read it, felt like trespassing on something sacred, but he took it anyway. The babies would want to know someday, he thought, would want to know who they were, where they came from, what their mother's last thoughts had been. The twins he named there in the ruins, without ceremony or thought, the names just appearing in his mind fully formed. The boy became Thomas, after Reed's own father, a man who died with his hands in the earth and dignity in his bearing. The girl became Lily, after Sarah's favorite flower, the one she'd always said she'd plant around their someday home. "Thomas and Lily," Reed said, testing the names, making them real. "All right then." Getting them secured for travel was another challenge entirely. Reed ended up fashioning a kind of sling from the woman's shawl, tying it across his chest so both babies could rest against him. It wasn't comfortable, for any of them, judging by the way Thomas kept fussing, but it would have to do. He couldn't ride with them in his arms, and he sure as hell couldn't leave them behind. By the time he mounted Ash again, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Reed had the capacity to notice. He didn't. His entire world had narrowed to the weight against his chest, the warmth of two small bodies, the responsibility that felt heavier than any gun he'd ever carried. "Come on, girl," he said to Ash, who'd been remarkably patient through all of this. "We've got a long ride ahead." He'd intended to make for Socorro, the nearest town of any size, where he could hand the babies off to someone qualified, a church maybe, or a family willing to take them in. But as Ash picked her way across the desert and the babies settled into a fitful sleep against him, Reed found himself questioning that plan, questioning everything. Because the truth was, he didn't trust the frontier to be kind to orphans. He'd seen too many children end up in situations that were only marginally better than death, worked to exhaustion in mines or brothels, sold into servitude, raised by people who saw them as labor rather than lives to be nurtured. And these two had already survived the impossible once. Didn't they deserve better than to be handed off to whoever would take them? "What the hell am I thinking?" Reed said aloud, and Lily stirred against him, making a small sound of protest. "I'm a killer, a drifter. I've got no home, no prospects, no business raising children." But even as he said it, even as he listed all the reasons this was insane, Reed kept writing, kept moving north instead of east toward Socorro, kept these babies close instead of planning how to let them go. Night fell with the suddenness it always did in the desert, the temperature dropping like a stone thrown down a well. Reed found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock and made camp, building a small fire and settling the babies on a bedroll while he tried to figure out how to feed them. The mashed vegetables in the jars seemed like the best option, and he managed to get some into Thomas using his finger as a crude spoon. Lily was more difficult, fussing and turning her head, and Reed felt panic rising in his chest. "Come on, sweetheart," he pleaded, his voice rough. "You gotta eat something, please." Eventually, through trial and error and more patience than Reed knew he possessed, he got some food into both of them. Not enough, probably. He had no idea how much a baby was supposed to eat, but better than nothing. He changed their makeshift diapers using strips of cloth and water from his canteen, talking to them the whole time even though they couldn't understand him. "Your mama loved you," he said as he worked, his hands surprisingly steady despite everything. "That's what you need to know. She loved you enough to die for you. That's more than most people get in this world. That's more than I ever got." Thomas stared up at him with those serious, unfocused eyes, and Reed felt something in his chest twist painfully. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, the words coming easier in the darkness, with only the fire and the stars as witnesses. "I don't know if I'm strong enough or good enough or anything enough, but I'm going to try. God help me. I'm going to try." He settled them both against his chest again, covered them with his coat, and sat with his back against the rock, staring into the fire. Sleep felt impossible, dangerous, but eventually exhaustion took him under and he drifted into uneasy dreams of flames and crying babies and a woman with dark hair who smiled at him from across an impossible distance. Dawn came cold and clear, and with it came new challenges. The babies were hungry again, and Reed's meager supplies were already running low. His plan, if he could even call it a plan, was to make for Sweetwater Creek, a small settlement he'd passed through once before. It was still several days' ride north, but it had a general store and a doctor and, most importantly, women who might know how to care for infants better than a broken-down gunslinger with blood on his hands. But 3 days across the desert with 2 babies was going to be brutal. Reed knew it, and he suspected the twins knew it too, judging by the way they both started crying as soon as the sun came up and the desert began its daily transformation from frozen to furnace. All right, Reed muttered, trying to soothe them both at once, his big hands awkward against their tiny bodies. "We're going. Hold on." The first day was hell. Thomas developed a cough that sent ice through Reed's veins every time he heard it. Lily refused most of the food Reed tried to give her, and by midday she'd developed a heat rash that made her scream every time he touched her. Ash was patient, but even she seemed stressed by the constant crying, her ears swiveling backward nervously every time one of the babies wailed. Reed rode in a state of low-level panic, constantly checking the babies, trying to keep them shaded from the sun, rationing the water he had between all of them. He talked to them constantly, his voice a rough murmur that seemed to help, at least a little. "See that ridge there? That's where we're headed today. And then tomorrow we'll make it to the creek bed. Should be some water there, even this time of year. And then the next day, if we're lucky, we'll hit Sweetwater Creek, and someone who actually knows what they're doing can help us." Bay. He told them about the desert, about the plants and animals, about the time he'd seen a roadrunner take down a rattlesnake twice its size. He told them about Sarah, about the life he'd almost had, about the man he might have been if things had gone differently. He told them things he'd never told another living soul, because somehow it was easier to confess your sins to babies who couldn't judge you, couldn't understand the weight of what you were saying. "I've killed people," he said on the second day, when Lily was fussing against his chest and Thomas was mercifully asleep. "Not sure how many exactly. Enough that I stopped counting. Most of them probably deserved it. They were men like me, men who'd made their choices and understood the consequences. But not all of them. Some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were just trying to protect what was theirs." Lily made a small sound, and Reed looked down at her tiny face scrunched up in concentration or discomfort, and felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. "But I'm going to try to be better," he promised her, promised himself, promised whatever God might be listening. "For you two, I'm going to try." By the third day, Reed was running on fumes. He'd barely slept, too afraid to close his eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. terrified that something would happen to the babies while he wasn't watching. His supplies were almost gone, and Thomas's cough had gotten worse despite Reed's best efforts to keep him warm and dry. He was beginning to think he'd made a terrible mistake, that he should have headed straight for Socorro, that his pride and his fear were going to get these children killed just as surely as the raiders had killed their parents. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, making every mile feel like 10. And then in the late afternoon of that third day, with the sun beating down mercilessly and both babies crying in harmony, Reed heard something that made his heart skip. Water. The sound of running water, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere beyond the next rise. He urged Ash forward, and when they crested the ridge, Reed felt something like hope flutter in his chest for the first time in 3 days. A creek, narrow but flowing, cutting through the desert like a silver thread, and beside it, beneath the sparse shade of a cottonwood tree, a figure. A woman. Reed's hand went to his gun automatically, that old instinct that had kept him alive, but he stopped himself. The woman had already seen him, was standing now, one hand raised in greeting or warning, the other hovering near something at her waist. As he got closer, Reed could make out more details. Middle-aged, maybe early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple dress, dusty from travel, and had a satchel slung over one shoulder. But what caught Reed's attention, what made him relax his hand away from his gun, was her expression. Not fear, not aggression, but concern. Her eyes had gone to the babies immediately, and she was already moving toward him before he'd even dismounted. "I heard crying," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Are they hurt?" Reed's throat was too dry for words. He just shook his head and dismounted carefully, cradling the babies against his chest. Up close, he could see the woman more clearly. Intelligent eyes, capable hands, the kind of steady presence that came from a life spent dealing with emergencies and staying calm in crisis. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the babies, and Reed found himself nodding, found himself carefully transferring Thomas and Lily into her arms, even though he'd only just met her and had no idea if he could trust her. But something in her manner, something in the way she immediately started checking them over with practiced efficiency, told Reed that this was someone who knew what she was doing, someone who might be able to help when he'd been drowning in his own inadequacy for 3 straight days. "I'm Nora," she said as she examined the babies, her hands gentle but thorough. "Nora Avery? I'm a midwife, heading to Sweetwater Creek." "Reed Callahan," he managed, his voice rougher than usual from disuse and desperation. They're not mine. I found them after a raid 3 days back. Their whole family was killed." Nora's expression flickered. Pain, understanding, a flash of anger at the injustice of it all. But she didn't stop her examination. "This one has a cough," she said, holding Thomas carefully. "How long?" "Started yesterday. I've been trying to keep him warm, but it's the desert, and you're traveling, and you're doing the best you can," Nora finished. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Reed felt like she was seeing past the dust and the stubble and the guns at his hip, seeing something underneath that even he had forgotten was there. "You did good, Mr. Callahan. Most men would have left them." "Couldn't," Reed said simply. They'd already survived the impossible. Seemed wrong to let them die in the aftermath. Nora smiled at that, a small smile that softened her weathered face. "Well then, let's make sure that doesn't happen." She moved with purpose, setting up a small camp near the water, sending Reed to gather firewood while she tended to the babies. By the time he returned, she had them both stripped down and was bathing them carefully in a shallow pan of warm water, talking to them in a low, soothing voice that seemed to calm even Thomas's cough. "The boy needs medicine," she said without looking up. "I have some wild cherry bark in my satchel. It'll help with the cough. The girl just needs proper feeding and some cream for that rash. You've been doing well, Mr. Callahan, but babies this young need more than mashed vegetables." "I didn't know what else to do," Reed admitted, feeling inadequate and stupid under her matter-of-fact assessment. I found them, and I couldn't leave them, and I've been making it up as I go." "Then you're doing better than most," Nora said, and there was approval in her voice that made something in Reed's chest warm despite the desert heat. "Most men would have panicked. You kept your head and kept them alive. That's what matters. She worked as she talked, her hands never stopping, preparing medicine for Thomas and a milk mixture for both babies that she explained was made from goat's milk powder and other things Reed didn't understand but trusted implicitly. When she handed Thomas back to him, cleaned and dressed in cloth that didn't smell like smoke and death, Reed felt his eyes sting with something he refused to name. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt insufficient for what she'd done, for the relief flooding through him at having someone else there, someone competent and calm and kind. "Don't thank me yet," Nora said, but she was smiling. "We've still got to keep them alive until we reach Sweetwater Creek. And this one," she nodded to Lily, who was now nursing contentedly from a makeshift bottle Nora had produced from her seemingly bottomless satchel, "is stubborn. She's going to give us trouble." "Can't blame her," Reed said, looking down at Thomas, who was staring up at him with those serious eyes. "She's had a rough start." "They both have," Nora agreed. "But they're strong. Survivors. Like they're— What are you to them, Mr. Callahan?" Reed opened his mouth to say he wasn't anything, that he was just the man who'd found them, who'd be handing them off as soon as he could find someone proper to take them. But the words stuck in his throat because looking at Thomas, feeling the weight of him in his arms, Reed realized he didn't want to hand them off, didn't want to let them go. "I don't know yet," he said finally, and it was the most honest answer he could give. "Mom." They made camp by the creek that night, and for the first time in 3 days, Reed let himself relax. Nora had taken charge of the babies with an efficiency that left him both grateful and a little bereft, and now Thomas and Lily were both sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from her bedroll and some sticks. Reed sat by the fire, watching Nora work, and found himself studying her in the flickering light. There was something about her that felt familiar, though he knew they'd never met before. Maybe it was just that she reminded him of Sarah, not in looks, but in that quiet competence, that way of moving through the world like she knew her place in it and wasn't apologizing for taking up space. "You're staring," Nora said without looking up from the shirt she was mending, one of Reed's which had torn during the ride. "Sorry," Reed said, though he didn't look away. "I was just thinking, you're heading to Sweetwater Creek. To stay or just passing through?" "To stay, I hope. There's a doctor there who needs a midwife, and I'm tired of traveling." She paused, her hands stilling on the fabric. "I've been on the road for 2 years, ever since my husband died. Figured it was time to settle somewhere, put down roots again." "I'm sorry about your husband." Nora shrugged, but Reed could see the pain in the gesture, old and deep and never quite healed. "Cholera. Took him and half the town in about 2 weeks. I tried to save them all, and I saved some, but not enough. Not him." "That's not on you," Reed said quietly. "Isn't it?" Nora looked up then, and her eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. "I'm a midwife, Mr. Callahan. I'm supposed to help people stay alive, and I couldn't even save my own husband." "I'm a killer," Reed said, surprising himself with the admission. "I've taken more lives than I can count, and I couldn't save my wife either. She died while I was out earning money I thought would keep her safe, so I guess we're both living with the weight of what we couldn't do." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them, 2 broken people in the middle of nowhere with 2 babies who'd somehow survived the unsurvivable. "Why didn't you just take them to Socorro?" Nora asked eventually. "It's closer than Sweetwater Creek. Plenty of people there who could have taken them." Reed looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that marked them as instruments of violence. "I don't trust the frontier to be kind to orphans, and these 2, they've already beaten the odds once. Seemed wrong to just hand them off to whoever would take them. So what are you planning to do with them?" "I don't know," Reed admitted. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. I just knew I couldn't leave them behind." Nora studied him for a long moment, and Reed had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen, really seen, for the first time in years. "You're a good man, Mr. Callahan, whether you believe it or not." "I've done things. We've all done things," Nora interrupted gently. "That's not what defines us. What defines us is what we do next." Reed didn't have an answer for that, so he just nodded and went back to watching the fire. But later, when he finally let himself sleep, he dreamed not of blood and flames, but of a house with a garden, and children's laughter, and a woman humming in the kitchen, And when he woke in the gray pre-dawn light with Lily crying against his chest, he found Nora already awake, heating milk over the revived fire, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this anymore. They traveled together the next morning, Reed and Nora and the twins, making their way north toward Sweetwater Creek. The dynamic had shifted overnight, where before Reed had been struggling alone, now there was partnership, an easy rhythm that developed between them as they took turns caring for the babies and managing the travel. Nora rode a sturdy paint horse she'd left tethered near the creek, and she told Reed stories as they traveled, about the places she'd been, the babies she'd helped deliver, the lives she'd touched in her wandering. Reed found himself listening with more attention than he'd given anything in years, found himself asking questions, engaging in conversation that wasn't about bounties or killing or the next town where he could drink enough to forget. "Tell me about them," Nora said around midday, nodding to the twins sleeping in Reed's arms. "About where you found them, if you want to talk about it." So Reed told her about the homestead and the bodies and the woman who'd died shielding her children, about the 3 days of fear and uncertainty and stubborn determination to keep these babies alive, about the promise he'd made standing in those ruins, the promise that felt both sacred and impossible. When he finished, Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Their mother would be grateful, I think, that someone like you found them, someone who cared enough to try." "I'm not sure I'm what they need," Reed said honestly. "Hell, I'm not sure I'm what anyone needs. I'm a drifter, Nora, a killer. I've got no home, no prospects." "You have them," Nora interrupted, gesturing to the babies. "And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's more than enough." Reed wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But the weight of his past felt crushing, the knowledge of everything he'd done and everything he'd failed to do pressing down on him like a physical force. "What if I can't do it?" he asked quietly. "What if I fail them like I failed Sarah?" Nora reached across the space between their horses and touched his arm, her hand warm and solid and real. "Then you'll have help. You're not alone anymore, Reed. Not unless you choose to be." And looking at her, at the certainty in her eyes and the strength in her bearing, Reed felt something shift inside him. Felt the first tiny crack in the wall he'd built around his heart start to widen into something that might, eventually, let light in again. "We should reach Sweetwater Creek by tomorrow evening," Nora said, pulling her hand back but leaving the warmth of her touch lingering on Reed's skin. "There's a boarding house there, run by a woman named Clara who won't ask too many questions. We can get the babies settled, figure out what comes next." "And what does come next?" Reed asked, because suddenly the future wasn't just a blank space anymore, but something that needed planning, needed thinking about. Nora smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger and more hopeful than Reed suspected she'd felt in a long time. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm willing to figure it out if you are." "I am," Reed said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. They rode on as the sun climbed higher, two strangers becoming something more, united by circumstance and two tiny lives that had somehow survived the impossible. And if Reed glanced over at Nora more often than strictly necessary, if he found himself noticing the way the sun caught in her hair and the sound of her laugh when Thomas made a funny face, well, that was just another impossible thing in a string of impossibilities. Some miracles, Reed was starting to learn, came not in thunder and lightning, but in quiet moments beside a desert creek, in the touch of a stranger's hand, in the weight of a baby against your chest, and the sudden terrifying realization that you'd do anything, give anything, to keep that weight safe. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty and full of promise, and for the first time in a decade, Reed Callahan allowed himself to hope. The sky had turned the color of old bruises by the time the first drops began to fall. Fat, heavy drops that hit the dust with tiny explosions and left dark circles spreading like ink on parchment. Reed looked up, squinting against the sudden wind that had picked up from the west, and felt his stomach drop. He'd seen enough frontier storms to know what was coming, and it wasn't going to be gentle. "We need shelter," Nora said, her voice tight with the same recognition. She'd already wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and was scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "And we need it now." Thomas chose that moment to start crying, his small face scrunching up against the first cold drops that found their way beneath Reed's coat. Lily followed a heartbeat later, and suddenly the air was filled with the sound of infant distress competing with the rising wind. "There," Reed said, pointing to a dark shape maybe half a mile to the east. "Looks like a structure. Might be abandoned." "Might be occupied," Nora countered, but she was already turning her horse in that direction. "But we don't have much choice, do we?" They didn't. The storm was rolling in fast, one of those sudden desert tempests that could turn deadly in minutes. Reed urged Ash forward, hunching his body around the twins to keep them as dry as possible while the wind picked up and the drops turned into a steady rain. By the time they reached the structure, a line shack, weathered and listing slightly to one side but still standing, they were all soaked through. Reed dismounted first, moving quickly to tie Ash to a post that looked sturdy enough while Nora did the same with her paint. The door to the shack hung crooked on leather hinges, and Reed pushed it open with his shoulder, gun drawn despite the babies in his arms, because abandoned didn't always mean empty. But the interior was vacant except for dust and shadows and the remnants of previous occupants. A broken chair in one corner, some old blankets piled against the wall, and blessedly, an iron stove that looked like it might still work. The roof had holes, but not as many as it could have, and the walls kept out most of the wind. It wasn't much, but it was better than being caught in the open. "It'll do," Nora said, already moving into action. She pulled the blankets from the wall, shook them out vigorously despite the dust they raised, and began fashioning a dry space near the stove. "Get a fire going if you can. We need to warm these babies up before the chill sets in." Reed handed Thomas and Lily to her, carefully, gently, like he was transferring the most precious cargo in the world, which maybe he was, and set about building a fire. The woodpile near the stove was mostly dry, protected by the building's overhang, and within minutes Reed had flames crackling and warmth beginning to push back against the cold that had seeped into their bones. Outside, the storm hit in earnest. Rain hammered against the roof with a sound like 1,000 tiny fists, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls, making the whole structure creak and groan. But inside their small circle of firelight, with the babies stripped of their wet clothes and wrapped in the least dusty blankets Nora could find, there was something almost peaceful about the moment. "That was close," Reed said, sitting back on his heels and watching Nora work. She'd hung their wet clothes near the fire to dry and was now examining Thomas with the same focused attention she'd shown by the creek. The baby's cough had worsened with the cold rain, and each rattling breath made Reed's chest tighten with worry. "Too close," Nora agreed. Her brow was furrowed in concentration as she pressed her ear to Thomas's tiny chest, listening. "His lungs sound congested. We need to keep him warm and dry, and I need to make more of that cherry bark tea." "Will he be all right?" Reed asked, hating how helpless he sounded, how completely out of his depth. Nora looked up at him, and her expression was honest rather than reassuring. "I don't know. He's young, and he's already been through so much. But he's strong. They both are. We just have to give them every chance we can." She set about preparing medicine while Reed tended the fire and tried to make the shack more livable. He found some old canvas in the corner that he used to patch the worst of the roof holes, and he moved the broken chair to block a gap in the wall where the wind was coming through particularly fierce. It was busy work, really, a way to feel like he was doing something useful while Nora handled the real crisis. When Thomas finally stopped coughing and drifted into an uneasy sleep against Nora's chest, Reed let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You should rest," Nora said quietly, adjusting the blanket around the baby. "I'll watch them for a while." "I can't," Reed admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that homestead, see their mother, see all the ways this could go wrong." "Then sit with me," Nora said, patting the space beside her on the blankets she'd spread out. "Tell me something, anything, just talk to me." So Reed sat, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and he found himself talking about things he'd kept locked away for years. About Sarah and the baby they'd lost. About the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out and left him nothing but a gun for hire. About the killing he'd done and the way it had stopped bothering him somewhere along the way, and how that scared him more than the actual killing ever had. "I thought I was past feeling anything," he said, staring into the fire. "Thought I'd burned out whatever part of me that could care about anything or anyone. And then I found them, and suddenly I'm terrified every second of every day because I care too much, because I can't lose them. I can't fail them the way I failed Sarah." "You didn't fail Sarah," Nora said firmly. "You weren't there. And that's tragic. But it's not the same as failing her. Sometimes terrible things just happen, Reed. Sometimes there's no one to blame and nothing that could have been done differently." "Easy to say. Harder to believe." "I know." Nora shifted Lily slightly, settling the baby more comfortably. "After my husband died, I spent months trying to figure out what I'd missed, what sign I should have seen that would have let me save him. I was a midwife. I was supposed to understand bodies, understand illness. But cholera doesn't care about understanding. It takes who it takes, and all the knowledge in the world doesn't change that." "So how did you move past it?" Reed asked, turning to look at her properly. In the firelight, her face was all shadows and warm tones, and he was struck again by how beautiful she was in an understated, enduring way. "I'm not sure I have," Nora admitted, "but I stopped letting it paralyze me. I decided that if I couldn't save everyone, I could at least try to save someone. And maybe that would be enough." "Is it? Enough, I mean." Nora smiled, sad and small. "Some days. Other days, no. But it's better than giving up entirely." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain and the occasional snuffle or sigh from the babies. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, but inside their small shelter, Reed felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be. "You're good with them," he said eventually, nodding toward the twins. "Natural." "I've delivered dozens of babies," Nora said. "You learn to be comfortable with them. Though I'll admit, caring for them long-term is different than just bringing them into the world and moving on. You ever want children of your own?" The question hung in the air between them, intimate and dangerous, and Reed immediately regretted asking it. But Nora didn't seem offended. She just looked down at Lily sleeping peacefully in her arms and said, "Yes, David and I tried for years, but it never happened. I used to think it was some kind of cosmic joke, a midwife who couldn't carry a child herself. But maybe it was just the way things were meant to be. I'm sorry. Don't be. I've made my peace with it." She paused, then added quietly, "Though holding these two makes me remember what I thought I'd have, what I wanted." Reed reached over and took Thomas from her carefully, cradling the boy against his chest. The baby's breathing was still rough, but seemed a little easier than it had been, and his small body was warm against Reed's skin. "What if we didn't give them up?" he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "What if we kept them, raised them ourselves?" Nora turned to stare at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Reed, I know it's crazy," he said quickly. "I know I'm the last person who should be suggesting it, but look at us, Nora. We're both alone. We're both heading to the same place. And these two, they need someone. Why couldn't it be us? Because you're a drifter, and I'm a midwife with no permanent home yet. Because we barely know each other. Because—" Nora stopped, shaking her head. "Because it's complicated." "Life's complicated," Reed countered. "That doesn't mean we stop trying. What are you really asking me, Reed?" He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her eyes, and the baby in her arms, and the future spreading out before them like the desert, vast and uncertain and full of possibility. "I'm asking if you'd consider staying, with me, with them, building something together instead of both of us doing it alone." "That's not a small thing you're asking." "I know. We've known each other less than 2 days. I know that too. And you have a dangerous past that could catch up with you at any moment." Reed nodded slowly. "That's true. And if you say no, I'll understand. But I have to ask, Nora. Because I look at you and I look at these babies, and I think maybe this is what I've been running toward all along. Maybe this is what redemption looks like." Nora was quiet for a long time, so long that Reed started to think she was searching for a polite way to refuse. But then she said, "I'm scared." "Of me?" "Of this. Of wanting something so badly and having it ripped away again. I don't know if I could survive that twice." Reed reached across and took her free hand in his calloused palm rough against her skin. "I can't promise you it'll be easy. Can't promise we won't fail. But I can promise I'll try my damnedest to make it work. To be the kind of man they deserve. The kind of man you deserve. What if you can't leave your past behind? What if it follows you? Then we face it together, Reed said simply. I'm done running, Nora. I'm done pretending I don't need anyone. These babies need us, and maybe we need each other. Lily stirred in Nora's arms, making a small sound of contentment, and Nora looked down at her with an expression so tender it made Reed's chest ache. When she looked back up at him, there were tears in her eyes. You should have stayed in St. Louis, Reed said softly, trying for humor even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. You don't belong in country this cruel. This country needs people who don't turn away, Nora replied, echoing what she'd said before. But now there was something else in her voice. Determination, maybe, or hope. And maybe you're right. Maybe this is what I've been traveling toward. A family that found me instead of me finding them. Is that a yes? Nora smiled through her tears. It's a maybe. A cautious, terrified, probably foolish maybe. But it's not a no. Reed felt something in his chest crack wide open, felt warmth flood through him that had nothing to do with the fire. I'll take a maybe. That's more than I deserve. We both deserve more than we've gotten, Nora said firmly. So let's figure out how to make this work. How to give these babies the life their mother wanted for them. How to be the people they need us to be. Together? Together, Nora agreed, and when she squeezed his hand, Reed squeezed back. Outside, the storm raged on through the night, but inside the line shack, surrounded by firelight and the soft breathing of sleeping babies, Reed Callahan and Nora Avery made their tentative peace with the idea of a future. It wasn't the future either of them had planned, wasn't what they'd expected when they'd woken that morning. But sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming, the miracles that appeared in the middle of storms and asked you to believe in them, despite all evidence to the contrary. Reed stayed awake long after Nora finally drifted off, her head tilted against his shoulder, Lily still cradled in her arms while Thomas slept against Reed's chest. He watched the fire burn down to embers and listened to the rain gradually soften from a hammering assault to a gentle patter, and he thought about the man he'd been just a week ago, alone, aimless, waiting for a bullet with his name on it to finally find him. That man was gone now, replaced by someone Reed barely recognized, someone who had responsibilities and people depending on him, someone who'd made promises he had to keep. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and Reed wasn't sure he was ready for it, wasn't sure he'd ever be ready for it, but he was going to try anyway. Because that's what you did when life handed you 2 orphaned babies and a woman with sad eyes and a generous heart. You tried, you hoped, you built something out of nothing and dared the universe to knock it down. When morning came, gray and damp, the storm had passed. Reed carefully extracted himself from the tangle of sleeping bodies and stepped outside to check on the horses. They were fine, huddled together for warmth, but otherwise unharmed by the night's violence. The desert had transformed in the rain, with tiny flowers already beginning to push through the wet sand. Nature's reminder that beauty could emerge from chaos if you just waited long enough. He was checking Ash's hooves when Nora emerged from the shack, squinting against the pale morning light. She'd wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders like a shawl, and her hair had come loose from its bun during the night, framing her face in soft waves. "They're still sleeping," she said, coming to stand beside him. "We should let them rest as long as possible. Thomas's breathing is better this morning." "That's good." Reed finished with Ash and straightened up, suddenly aware of how close Nora was standing, how easy it would be to reach out and touch her. "I was thinking, we're maybe a day's ride from Sweetwater Creek still. If the babies hold up, we could make it by evening." "And then what?" Nora asked. "We walk in with 2 infants and say we're keeping them?" "Something like that. Though I suppose we should probably figure out the details first, like where we're going to live and how we're going to explain this." He gestured between them, trying to encompass everything they'd agreed to in the firelight. Nora smiled. "We tell them the truth. That we found 2 babies who needed help, and we're providing it. The rest, we can figure out as we go." "People will talk," Reed warned. "A gunslinger and a midwife raising orphans together. That's going to raise questions." "Let them talk," Nora said, with a shrug that tried for casual but didn't quite make it. I stopped caring what people thought about me when David died. Life's too short to waste on other people's opinions. Even if some of those opinions might be right, about me being dangerous, about my past catching up with us. Nora turned to face him fully, and there was steel in her eyes that Reed found himself admiring. Everyone has a past, Reed. What matters is what you do with your future. And right now, your future involves 2 babies who need you, and a woman who's willing to help you figure it out, unless you're having second thoughts. No, Reed said quickly. No second thoughts. Just making sure you understand what you're getting into. I understand perfectly. Now come on, we should get moving before the babies wake up demanding breakfast. They broke camp efficiently, working together like they'd been doing it for years instead of days. Reed saddled the horses while Nora changed the babies and prepared bottles, and within an hour they were back on the trail, heading north under a sky that was slowly clearing to brilliant blue. The conversation flowed easier now, with some of the tension from the previous night dissipated. Nora told Reed about Sweetwater Creek, about the doctor who'd offered her a position and the small house that came with it. It's not much, she said. 2 rooms and a kitchen. But it's mine, or will be once I arrive. There's space for a small garden, and the doctor mentioned that the previous midwife had converted the shed into a sort of clinic. Sounds nice, Reed said, trying to imagine it. A house, a garden, permanence. The concepts felt foreign after so many years of drifting. You could stay there too, Nora said carefully. With the babies, I mean. Until we figure out something more permanent. The doctor knows I'm coming alone, but I don't think he'd object to an expanded household. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. I want to. Besides, it makes sense, doesn't it? The babies need both of us. And it would look better, more proper, if we were all under one roof. Reed glanced over at her, at the way she was carefully not meeting his eyes. People are still going to talk, Nora, about us living together without being married. Then maybe we should get married, Nora said, and the words came out so matter-of-factly that it took Reed a moment to process what she'd said. What? Now Nora did look at him, and there was color in her cheeks, but her gaze was steady. I'm not proposing exactly. I'm just pointing out the logical solution. If we're going to raise these babies together, if we're going to be a family, then we might as well make it official. For their sake, if nothing else. That's not how marriage is supposed to work, Reed managed, his brain still catching up with the conversation. How is it supposed to work then? 2 people who barely know each other getting married because they're in love? That's not any more rational than what I'm suggesting. At least our way has a practical purpose. Love usually comes into it somewhere, Reed pointed out. Nora was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. I cared deeply for David. Loved him? Even in the way you love someone you've built a life with. But I'm not sure I was ever in love with him, not the way stories and songs talk about it. We were partners, companions, friends, and that was enough. More than enough. You think that's what we could be? Partners? I think we could be whatever we decide to be, Nora said. I think we could build something good, something stable for these children, and maybe, along the way, we'd find that we'd built something good for ourselves too. Reed looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his arms, despite the motion of the horse. The baby's face was relaxed now, his breathing easier, and there was something about the trust implicit in that relaxation that made Reed's throat tight. This child trusted him, needed him, deserved better than a father who was still running from his past. What if I can't be what you need? He asked quietly. What if I'm too broken, too damaged? Then we'll be broken together, Nora replied. I'm not asking for perfection, Reed. I'm just asking for partnership, for someone who'll share the load and help me give these babies a chance at a good life. Can you do that? Could he? Reed had spent years convinced he was incapable of caring for anyone, of being responsible for anything other than his next job and his next bottle. But holding Thomas, thinking about Lily sleeping in Nora's arms, imagining a small house with a garden and a life that extended beyond the next town and the next gunfight, Reed found that he wanted to try, wanted it with a desperation that surprised him. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I can do that. Nora's smile was radiant, transforming her whole face. Then we have a plan. We'll get to Sweetwater Creek, get settled in the house, and we'll go see the minister. Make it official before anyone has a chance to gossip. Just like that? Just like that. Unless you'd prefer a big ceremony with flowers and a white dress. Reed laughed, the sound startling in its genuineness. I think we can skip that part, though you deserve flowers at least. I'll settle for a roof that doesn't leak and babies who sleep through the night, Nora said, but she looked pleased. They rode on through the morning, the landscape gradually shifting as they left the deep desert behind and entered slightly greener country. The conversation drifted to practical matters, what supplies they'd need, how to register the babies, what story they'd tell about how they'd found them. Reed felt something loosening in his chest with each mile, felt the weight of the past week beginning to settle into something manageable rather than crushing. By midday, Thomas's cough had returned, worse than before. The baby's face flushed red with each rattling breath, and his cries took on a desperate quality that sent ice through Reed's veins. Nora immediately called for them to stop, and they made camp in a small grove of cottonwoods near a dry wash. "He's getting worse," Reed said, watching helplessly as Nora examined the baby. "What do we do?" "We keep him warm, keep giving him the medicine, and we pray," Nora said, but Reed could hear the worry in her voice. "And we get to Sweetwater Creek as fast as we can. The doctor there will have real medicine, things I don't carry with me." "How far?" 4 hours, maybe 5 if we push hard." "But Reed," Nora looked up at him, and there was fear in her eyes. "I don't know if he'll make it that long. His lungs are filling with fluid, and without proper treatment—" "Then we'll get him proper treatment," Reed interrupted. "We'll ride through the night if we have to. We're not losing him, Nora. Not after everything." "We might not have a choice." "There's always a choice," Reed said fiercely. "We just have to be stubborn enough to fight for it." So they rode, harder than they should have with babies. But they had no other option. Reed held Thomas against his chest, feeling each labored breath, whispering constant reassurances, even though he didn't know if the baby could hear him or understand. Lily, sensing something wrong, began to fuss as well, and Nora had to divide her attention between keeping the little girl calm and watching Thomas's condition deteriorate. The sun was setting when they finally crested the last ridge and saw Sweetwater Creek spread out in the valley below. A small collection of buildings clustered around an actual creek, with cultivated fields spreading out on either side. It was beautiful in the golden light, peaceful and permanent in a way that made Reed's chest ache with longing. But there was no time to appreciate it. They urged their horses down the slope and into town at a pace that drew stares from the few people on the street. Reed barely noticed, his entire focus on finding the doctor's office, on getting Thomas the help he desperately needed. "There," Nora said, pointing to a building with a painted sign that read, "Dr. Samuel Morrison, physician and surgeon." She was off her horse before it had fully stopped, Lily clutched against her chest, and Reed followed suit, cradling Thomas carefully as they rushed inside. The doctor was an older man with kind eyes and steady hands, and he took one look at Thomas and immediately cleared his examination table. "What happened?" he asked, already listening to the baby's chest with a stethoscope. "Pneumonia, I think," Nora said, her professional calm sliding into place even though Reed could see her hands shaking. "I've been treating him with wild cherry bark tea, but he's getting worse. He needs something stronger." Dr. Morrison nodded, already moving to prepare medicine. "You must be Miss Avery. I wasn't expecting you for another few days." "Plans changed," Nora said shortly. "Can you help him?" "I'll do my best. The baby's strong. That's in his favor. But you're right, it's pneumonia, and in an infant this young." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Reed stood there, feeling useless and terrified as the doctor worked. Nora was helping, following instructions with practiced efficiency, but Reed could only watch and wait, and silently bargain with whatever God might be listening. "Take me instead," he thought. "I've lived long enough, done enough damage. But let this baby live. Let both of them live. Give them the chance I squandered." It was full dark by the time Dr. Morrison stepped back from the table, wiping his hands on a cloth. Thomas was breathing easier now, his color better, though he was still sleeping the exhausted sleep of the very ill. "He'll live," the doctor said, and Reed felt his knees go weak with relief. "But it was close. Another few hours, and—" He shook his head. "You did good work keeping him alive this long, Miss Avery. And you, sir, he turned to Reed, you got him here in time. That took courage. Desperation, more like, Reed muttered, but he was smiling despite himself. Thomas was going to live. They'd made it. Dr. Morrison looked between them, his expression curious but not judgmental. I take it there's a story here? About how you came to have these babies? So they told him, a simplified version, leaving out the worst of the violence, focusing on the survival and the journey. The doctor listened without interrupting, and when they finished, he just nodded slowly. Well then, welcome to Sweetwater Creek, all of you. Miss Avery, your house is ready whenever you want to move in. And Mr. Callahan, I assume you'll be staying as well? If that's all right, Reed said, glancing at Nora. More than all right, Dr. Morrison said. This town could use a man with your particular skills. We've been having trouble with raiders lately. Different group than the one that attacked that homestead, but cut from the same cloth. A man who knows his way around a gun would be welcome, provided he's on the right side of the law. Reed felt something twist in his gut. I'm not sure I'm the right man for that, Doctor. My past, your past is your business, Dr. Morrison interrupted gently. What matters to me is what you do here in Sweetwater Creek. And from what I've seen today, you're a man who fights for what he loves. That's the kind of man we need. Later, after they'd settled the babies in the room Dr. Morrison kept for overnight patients, after Nora had fed and changed them both, and Reed had collapsed into a chair from sheer exhaustion, they finally had a moment to breathe. We made it, Nora said, sitting down beside him. I wasn't sure we would, but we did. Because of you, Reed said. I would have lost them both if you hadn't been there. No, you wouldn't have. You'd have found a way. That's who you are, Reed. A survivor. And now you're teaching them to be survivors, too. Reed reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. It felt natural, right? Like they'd been doing it for years. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. For believing in this crazy plan. For believing in me. Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running, Nora replied, for showing me that maybe it's not too late to have a family after all. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching Thomas and Lily sleep, and Reed thought about the future spreading out before them, uncertain and probably difficult, but theirs to shape however they chose. Tomorrow they'd move into Nora's house, would start figuring out how to be a family. Eventually they'd stand before a minister and make vows neither of them was entirely sure they could keep. But tonight, in this quiet room with two babies breathing easily and a woman's hand warm in his, Reed Callahan felt something he'd thought died with Sarah all those years ago. He felt hope. And for now, that was enough. The house was smaller than Reed had imagined, but somehow that made it more perfect. Two rooms connected by a narrow hallway with a kitchen that opened onto a small back porch overlooking what would someday be a garden. The furniture was simple. A bed frame without a mattress, a table with two chairs, shelves built into the walls, but the bones were good. The roof didn't leak, the windows had glass that wasn't cracked, and there was a stone fireplace that would keep them warm when winter came. Reed stood in the doorway holding Thomas while Nora walked through with Lily, her fingers trailing along the walls like she was memorizing the texture of home. Morning light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes and turning them golden, and for a moment the whole scene felt suspended in amber, precious and fragile and almost too good to be real. It needs work, Nora said, but there was wonder in her voice. The floor's uneven in the kitchen, and that back door doesn't hang quite right. But Reed, it's ours. Actually ours. Yours, Reed corrected gently. The doctor gave it to you, not me. Nora turned to face him, and there was determination in the set of her jaw. Ours, she repeated firmly. We're in this together, remember? That was the agreement. The agreement. They'd talked late into the night after Thomas had stabilized, working out the details of their arrangement with the same practical efficiency they'd applied to everything else. They'd go to the minister that afternoon, have a simple ceremony with Dr. Morrison and his wife as witnesses. They'd register the babies as their own, not exactly legal, but the frontier was loose about such things, and no one was going to ask too many questions about orphans who needed homes. And they'd build a life here in Sweetwater Creek, two broken people trying to create something whole for the children in their care. It was logical, practical. and it terrified Reed more than any gunfight ever had. I should get started on repairs, he said, needing something to do with his hands, some way to be useful. That door won't fix itself. Reed, Nora's voice stopped him before he could turn away. Are you having second thoughts? Because if you are, it's all right to say so. Better now than after we've made promises we can't keep. He looked at her standing there in the dusty light, this woman who'd appeared beside a creek like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying, and felt his throat tighten. I'm terrified, he admitted. Not of you, not of them, of failing, of being the reason this all falls apart. Then we'll be terrified together, Nora said, closing the distance between them until she could rest her free hand on his arm. And we'll fail sometimes, because that's what people do. But we'll also succeed sometimes. We'll figure it out, Reed, one day at a time. Thomas chose that moment to wake fully, his face scrunching up in preparation for a wail, and the spell broke. Nora laughed, the sound lighter than Reed had heard from her before, and moved to take the baby. Someone's hungry. Why don't you go find us a mattress and some basic supplies while I feed them? Dr. Morrison mentioned there's a general store 2 streets over. You sure you'll be all right alone? Reed, I've been alone for 2 years. A few hours won't kill me. But her smile softened the words, and when Reed left, he carried the warmth of that smile with him like a talisman. Sweetwater Creek was larger than it had seemed in the twilight panic of their arrival. Maybe 200 souls, Reed estimated, most of them clustered around the main street that ran parallel to the creek itself. There was the general store Nora had mentioned, a saloon that looked relatively respectable, a church with a white steeple, a blacksmith, and a handful of other businesses that suggested a town trying to establish itself as more than just a waypoint. People stared as Reed walked past, not hostile, but curious, taking in his travel-worn clothes and the guns at his hip. He caught fragments of whispered conversation. That's the man who rode in with Miss Avery. Heard they've got babies. Wonder what his story is. But nobody approached him directly. Small-town caution, Reed recognized. They'd wait and watch before deciding whether he was friend or threat. The general store was run by a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and capable hands. She looked Reed up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen enough frontier drifters to know trouble when she saw it, but her voice was polite when she asked how she could help. Need a mattress, Reed said. And basic supplies, food, blankets, whatever a household with 2 babies might require. Her eyebrows rose. You're with Miss Avery, then, the midwife? Yes, ma'am. Reed hesitated, then added, We're getting married this afternoon. The babies they're ours now. He waited for judgment, for suspicion, but the woman's expression softened instead. Well then, congratulations are in order, I suppose. I'm Clara Bennett. I run the boarding house as well as this store. Dr. Morrison mentioned Miss Avery was coming, but he didn't say anything about a husband. It's a recent development, Reed said, which was certainly true. Clara's smile suggested she understood more than he'd said. Recent or not, this town could use more families, and babies especially. We've got more old-timers than young ones these days. You'll want diapers then, and milk powder, though if Miss Avery's a midwife, she probably knows about feeding. Still, better to have extra. She moved through the store with efficient purpose, pulling items from shelves and making a pile on the counter. Reed watched, feeling oddly detached from the whole transaction. This was domesticity, he realized. This was what normal people did. Bought mattresses and milk powder and worried about whether they had enough diapers. It felt alien and uncomfortable and strangely appealing all at once. That'll be $18, Clara said when she'd finished. I can have my son help you carry the mattress to Miss Avery's place. Excuse me, your place now. Reed counted out the money from his dwindling supply, trying not to think about how he'd earn more. The life of a gun for hire was behind him now, had to be behind him if he was going to be any kind of father to Thomas and Lily. But he didn't know how to be anything else, didn't have any skills beyond shooting and tracking and staying alive in hostile territory. Mrs. Bennett, he said as she was wrapping his purchases, Dr. Morrison mentioned the town's been having trouble with raiders. That's still going on? Her expression darkened. Unfortunately, yes. They hit the McAllister Ranch 3 weeks ago, made off with cattle and supplies. Sheriff's doing what he can, but we're a small town with limited resources. Why do you ask? Just wondering if there might be work for someone with my particular skills. Clara studied him for a long moment, and Reed saw her reassessing, taking in the worn grips of his pistols and the way he stood, balanced, ready, like a man who'd spent years expecting trouble. You're a gunfighter. It wasn't a question, but Reed nodded anyway. Was. Trying to be something else now. But if the town needs protection, talk to Sheriff Reeves. His office is next to the church. But Mr. Callahan? Clara's voice sharpened. If you're planning to bring trouble to this town, you should know we don't take kindly to it. We've worked hard to build something decent here. No trouble, Reed promised. Just trying to make an honest living, keep my family safe. Then we'll get along fine. Clara's smile returned, though it was more cautious now. Welcome to Sweetwater Creek, Mr. Callahan. I hope you find what you're looking for here. Reed left the store with Clara's teenage son helping to carry the mattress, his arms full of packages and his mind full of questions. Could he really do this? Could a man who'd killed for money transform into someone who bought milk powder and worried about mattresses? The gap between those two versions of himself felt impossibly wide. But when he arrived back at the house and found Nora on the porch, both babies sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a drawer and some blankets, something in Reed's chest settled. This was why he was doing it. These three people were his why, his purpose, his redemption. You got a mattress, Nora said, smiling, and judging by those packages, quite a bit more. The storekeeper was helpful, pushy, but helpful. Reed set down his load and dismissed the boy with a coin and a word of thanks. I also heard about the raider problem. Thought I might talk to the sheriff about helping out. Nora's smile faded. Reed, I know what you're going to say, but we need income, and this is what I know how to do. I'm not hiring out as a killer, Nora. I'm offering to help protect the town. There's a difference. Is there? Nora challenged, but her voice was more worried than angry. Or are you just looking for a way to stay in the life you know, because this, she gestured at the house, the babies, the domesticity of it all, is too unfamiliar and scary. The words hit harder because they were partly true. Reed felt his jaw tighten defensively before he forced himself to relax. Maybe there's some of that, he admitted, but it's also practical. We need money, and the town needs help. I can provide both. At what cost? What if you get hurt? What if someone from your past recognizes you and brings trouble here? Then I'll handle it. Nora, I can't just stop being who I am. The skills I have, they're a part of me. Maybe I can use them for something good for once, instead of just survival. Nora was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving from Reed to the sleeping babies and back again. Finally, she sighed. I can't stop you. Wouldn't try to, even if I could. I'm not your keeper. But Reed, please be careful. These children have already lost one set of parents. I don't want them losing another. They won't, Reed promised, reaching out to take her hand. I'm not planning to be a hero, just a man doing his job and coming home at night. That's all. That better be all, Nora said, squeezing his fingers. Because we have an appointment with Minister Blackwood in 2 hours, and I'll be damned if I'm getting married in a dusty dress. Help me move this mattress inside, then make yourself scarce while I make us presentable. The ceremony was brief and oddly surreal. Minister Blackwood was a thin man with kind eyes who asked no uncomfortable questions about how they'd met or why they were marrying so quickly. Dr. Morrison and his wife served as witnesses, standing beside them in the small church while sunlight streamed through the windows and turned everything golden. Reed spoke his vows in a voice that only shook slightly, promising to honor and cherish, to protect and provide, until death parted them. The words felt heavy, weighted with meaning he wasn't sure he fully understood. Nora's voice was steadier when she repeated the same promises, her hand warm in his, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Reed felt something shift in his chest, a door closing on his old life, and another opening onto something unknown. You may kiss your bride, Minister Blackwood said with a smile. Reed looked at Nora, at this woman who was now legally his wife, and saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. But there was determination there too, and when he leaned in to press a chaste kiss to her lips, she didn't pull away. It was brief, almost businesslike, but it felt like a seal on the promises they'd made, promises to try, to build, to be better than the people they'd been before. Dr. Morrison insisted on buying them dinner at the boarding house to celebrate, and they spent an awkward hour making small talk with Clara Bennett and a few other townspeople who'd heard about the wedding. Reed fielded questions about where he was from and what he did with vague answers that seemed to satisfy most people's curiosity. Nora was more forthcoming, talking about her work as a midwife and her hopes for establishing a proper clinic in Sweetwater Creek. Through it all, Thomas and Lily slept or fussed in turns, requiring attention that gave Reed and Nora an excuse to cut the socializing short. By the time they made it back to their house, their home, Reed corrected himself mentally. Full dark had fallen, and exhaustion was pulling at both of them. "I'll take the floor," Reed said as they stood awkwardly in the bedroom, the single mattress suddenly seeming very small. "You should have the bed." "Don't be ridiculous. The mattress is big enough for both of us. We're married now. It's not improper." But Nora's cheeks were flushed as she said it, and she busied herself with settling the babies in their makeshift cradle rather than meeting Reed's eyes. "Nora, Reed, we're both adults. We can share a bed without it meaning anything more than practical sleeping arrangements, unless you're uncomfortable." "No, I don't want you to feel obligated. This marriage, it's not... We didn't do this because we're in love. I don't want you to think I expect..." "I know what you expect and don't expect," Nora interrupted, finally looking at him. "We made an agreement based on practical necessity, not romance. I understand that. But we're also going to be living in close quarters with two babies who wake at all hours. We might as well be comfortable." So they lay down side by side in the darkness, carefully not touching, the space between them feeling charged with awkwardness and unspoken questions. Reed stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd shared a bed with anyone, tried not to notice the warmth radiating from Nora's body or the soft sound of her breathing. "Reed?" Nora's voice came quietly through the darkness. "Yeah?" "Thank you. For today. For all of this. I know it's not what you expected from your life, but thank you." "Thank you too," Reed said, and meant it more than he could express. "For giving me a reason to stop running." They fell asleep like that, two strangers bound by vows and circumstance. And when Thomas woke crying in the deep hours of night, they both rose to tend him with the fumbling coordination of new parents everywhere. Reed held the baby while Nora prepared milk, and as Thomas settled against his chest with that absolute trust only infants possessed, Reed felt something in his heart crack open just a little wider. The next few days passed in a blur of domestic routine that Reed found both monotonous and oddly comforting. They fell into patterns without discussing them. Nora handled most of the baby's care during the day while Reed worked on fixing up the house and exploring the town. He replaced the broken hinge on the back door, patched the uneven floor in the kitchen, built proper shelves for their meager supplies. Physical work that let him feel useful while his mind adjusted to this new reality. He also visited Sheriff Reeves, a grizzled man in his 60s who looked Reed over with the skeptical eye of someone who dealt with plenty of gunslingers claiming to want honest work. But after a long conversation and what felt like an interrogation about Reed's past, the sheriff grudgingly agreed to deputize him on a temporary basis. "We need men who can shoot," Reeves said bluntly. "But I won't tolerate any cowboy justice or settling old scores. You work for me. You follow my rules. Understood?" "Understood," Reed agreed, and tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered he was making a mistake, that violence would find him no matter how hard he tried to leave it behind. The work was sporadic at first, writing fence lines, checking on outlying ranches, showing a presence that might deter raiders. Reed found himself partnered with a young deputy named Collins, who talked too much and shot too little, but who had good instincts and a genuine desire to protect the town. They rode together in comfortable silence interrupted by Collins' occasional attempts at conversation, and Reed found himself almost enjoying the work. There was a purity to it, a rightness that hired killing had never possessed. But the real adjustment came in the evenings, when Reed returned home to find Nora cooking dinner, while the babies played on blankets spread across the floor. Thomas was getting stronger every day, his cough fading to nothing under Nora's careful attention. Lily had developed a habit of grabbing anything within reach and attempting to eat it, which meant constant vigilance and frequent rescues. They ate together at the small table, talking about their days with the stilted politeness of people still learning each other's rhythms. Nora told him about the women who'd started coming to her with questions about pregnancies and children, about how she was slowly building a practice. Reed told her about the ranches he'd checked and the suspicious tracks Collins had found near the Miller property. "You think the raiders will come back?" Nora asked one evening, her hand stilling on the shirt she was mending. "Probably. They've hit 3 ranches in 2 months. That's a pattern. They'll push until someone pushes back. And you'll be there when they do." It wasn't a question, but Reed nodded anyway. "That's the job." Nora set down her mending and looked at him across the table, her expression troubled. "I know I said I wouldn't try to stop you. But Reed, every time you ride out, I worry. The babies worry, even if they're too young to understand. We've built this fragile thing here, this family, and it feels like it could shatter so easily." "It won't," Reed said with more confidence than he felt. "I'm careful. I'm not looking for glory or trying to prove anything. I just want to keep you all safe." "And who keeps you safe?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Reed had spent so many years keeping himself alive through skill and luck, and sheer stubborn refusal to die that he'd forgotten what it was like to have someone worry about him. The weight of Nora's concern felt simultaneously burdensome and precious. "I do," he said finally, "and I've gotten pretty good at it over the years." "That's what worries me," Nora said quietly. "Men who are good at surviving alone often don't know how to live with others." Before Reed could respond, Thomas started fussing, and the moment passed. But Nora's words stayed with him as he lay in bed that night, carefully maintaining the invisible boundary between them, even as her warmth called to something lonely inside him. Was she right? Was he so accustomed to solitude that he'd sabotaged this chance at something more? The question was still gnawing at him 3 days later when the raiders finally made their move. Reed was riding with Collins near sunset, checking the western approaches to town, when they heard gunfire echoing across the valley. Not the scattered pops of hunting, but the sustained crack of rifles in combat. "That's coming from Red Rock Canyon," Collins said, his face pale but determined. "The Johnson place." They rode hard, covering the 3 miles in minutes that felt like hours. As they crested the ridge overlooking the Johnson Ranch, Reed took in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who'd seen too many raids. 5 raiders, maybe 6, hitting the ranch house and barn while the family tried to mount a defense from inside. The ranch hands were either dead or had run. Reed could see bodies in the yard. "We need backup," Collins said, already turning his horse. "There's no time," Reed countered, his hand moving to check his weapons. "They'll kill everyone before help arrives." "There's only 2 of us. We can't—" "I can." Reed met the younger man's eyes, saw the fear there, but also the determination. "Collins, I need you to ride back to town, get the sheriff and whoever else will come. I'll keep them busy until you get back." "That's suicide." "That's the job," Reed said, echoing what he'd told Nora. "Now go." Collins hesitated for one more second, then wheeled his horse and rode. Reed waited until he was out of sight, then turned back to survey the situation. 6 raiders, he revised, watching them move, all armed, all experienced based on how they worked together. Bad odds for one man, but Reed had survived worse. He thought about Nora, about the babies, about the promise he'd made to come home. But he also thought about the family trapped in that ranch house, about the woman who'd died sheltering Thomas and Lily, about all the people who'd died while he was too far away or too late to help. Not this time. Reed loaded his rifles, checked his pistols, and began picking his way down the ridge. The setting sun was at his back, putting the raiders in silhouette and making him harder to spot. He moved with practiced silence, closing the distance until he was within range, and then he opened fire. The first raider dropped before the others realized they were under attack. The second fell while they were still scrambling for cover, Reed's bullet taking him through the chest with clinical precision. Then the return fire started and Reed had to move, using cover and motion and every trick he'd learned in a decade of gunfights. He thought of it as buying time. Every second he kept the raiders focused on him was a second the family in the house stayed alive, a second closer to backup arriving. But time was a fluid thing in combat, and Reed lost track of it as he moved and shot and moved again, his world narrowing to the immediate calculus of survival. A bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and sharp. but Reed barely felt it. Another took his hat clean off. He dropped a third raider and wounded a fourth before his rifle jammed, forcing him to switch to pistols at closer range. The raiders were trying to flank him now, and Reed fell back toward the barn, using its bulk for cover while he reloaded. That's when he saw her. A woman had emerged from the ranch house, rifle in hand, and was laying down covering fire while her husband dragged their wounded son inside. She was exposed, vulnerable, and one of the raiders was lining up a shot that would kill her. Reed didn't think. He just moved, running out from cover and firing as he ran. His first shot missed. His second took the raider in the leg, spoiling his aim. His third, the impact hit Reed in the chest, driving the air from his lungs and sending him sprawling. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare up at the sky that was turning from gold to purple as the sun set. This was it, he thought with odd clarity. This was how it ended, not in some dramatic shootout, but in a ranch yard, buying time for strangers. But he'd bought enough time. Even through the ringing in his ears, Reed could hear horses approaching, could hear Sheriff Reeves's voice shouting orders. The remaining raiders broke and ran, and Reed let them go, too focused on the more immediate problem of breathing. Callahan. Someone was kneeling beside him. Collins, his young face stricken. Hang on, we've got the doctor coming. Just hang on. Reed tried to respond, but blood filled his mouth and darkness filled his vision. His last coherent thought was of Nora's face, of the fear in her eyes when she'd asked who would keep him safe, and the bitter knowledge that he'd failed to answer that question. He woke to pain and the smell of carbolic acid. Dr. Morrison's clinic, Reed realized, recognizing the ceiling. His chest felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through it, and breathing took conscious effort, but he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. Easy. Nora's voice, sharp with worry and relief. Her face swam into focus above him, tear-streaked and beautiful. Don't try to move. You were shot. The bullet hit your pocket watch and deflected into your shoulder instead of your heart. Reed's hand moved shakily to his chest, feeling bandages and the shape of broken metal beneath. His father's watch, the one thing he'd kept from his old life. It had stopped a bullet and saved his life. The family? He managed to rasp. Safe. All of them, because of you. Nora's voice cracked. You stupid, brave, impossible man. You could have died. But I didn't. But you could have! She was crying now, really crying, and Reed felt his own eyes sting in response. You could have left us alone, left the babies without a father, left me without... She broke off, shaking her head. Without what? Reed asked, reaching up to touch her face despite the pain the movement caused. Without you, Nora said simply. I know this marriage was supposed to be practical, supposed to be about the babies and nothing more. But somewhere in the last week, it became more than that for me. And the thought of losing you, of having to tell Thomas and Lily that you died being a hero. She couldn't finish. Reed pulled her down gently, ignoring the screaming protest from his shoulder, and kissed her properly for the first time since their wedding. Not chaste, not businesslike, but real and full of all the things he didn't have words for. When they broke apart, Nora was still crying, but she was also smiling. I'm sorry, Reed said. You were right. I was holding on to the old life because I was scared of the new one. But Nora, I swear to you, I'm done. No more hero bullshit. No more risking everything. I'm coming home. Promise? Promise, Reed said, and meant it with everything he had. You're stuck with me now, Mrs. Callahan. For better or worse, remember? I remember, Nora said, and kissed him again. Later, when the babies were brought in to see him, Thomas gurgling happily and Lily trying to grab his bandages with chubby fists, Reed felt the last of his old life finally release its grip. He was a husband now, a father, a man with people who needed him to come home at night. And whatever that meant, whatever changes he needed to make, he'd make them. Because this small, imperfect, beautiful family was worth more than all the bounties he'd ever collected and all the glory he'd ever chased. This was what redemption looked like, and Reed was finally ready to embrace it. Reed spent 3 days in Dr. Morrison's clinic, 3 days that felt like 3 years as his body slowly remembered how to function without screaming pain accompanying every breath. The bullet wound in his shoulder was healing cleanly, but the bruising across his chest where the pocket watch had taken the impact painted his skin in shades of purple and black that made Nora wince every time she changed his bandages. She came twice a day, morning and evening, bringing the babies with her and filling the sterile room with the chaos of infant needs and the comfort of family. Thomas had started making new sounds, not quite babbling, but getting close, and he'd stare at Reed with those serious eyes like he was trying to figure out what had happened to make his father unable to hold him properly. Lily was less contemplative and more demanding, fussing until Nora positioned her just right on Reed's lap, where she could grab at his shirt buttons and drool contentedly. "Doctor, Morrison says you can come home tomorrow," Nora said on the third evening, settling into the chair beside his bed, while both babies dozed in their basket. "If you promise to take it easy and not do anything stupid like chasing raiders or lifting heavy objects or generally acting like you weren't shot." "I promise," Reed said, and he meant it. The fight had gone out of him somewhere between the bullet hitting his chest and waking up to Nora's tears. He'd proven whatever he'd needed to prove to himself in the town, and now he just wanted to go home. "How are things at the house?" "Quiet, lonely." Nora's smile was rueful. "I didn't realize how quickly I'd gotten used to having you there. The babies miss you too. Thomas keeps looking toward the door like he's waiting for you to walk through it." "I miss you all too. Miss our bed." Reed caught himself. "I mean, miss sleeping in an actual bed instead of this clinic cot." But Nora's expression had softened at his slip. "Our bed," she repeated quietly. "It's strange how natural that sounds now. How natural all of this has become, even though it's only been a couple of weeks." "Strange good or strange bad?" "Strange good," Nora said, reaching over to take his hand. "Reed, I meant what I said when you woke up. This stopped being just a practical arrangement for me. I don't know exactly when it happened, maybe when you first handed Thomas to me by the creek, or maybe when you promised to come home after the raid. But somewhere along the way, I started caring about you, really caring." Reed's throat tightened. "I care about you too. More than I thought I was capable of anymore. You and Thomas and Lily, you've given me something I didn't think I deserved, a second chance." "We've given each other that," Nora corrected. "I was just drifting before I met you, Reed, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. But these past weeks, taking care of the babies with you, building a home together, it's reminded me what it feels like to want tomorrow to come, instead of just enduring until it does." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, while the clinic settled into its evening rhythms around them. Dr. Morrison made his rounds, checking Reed's wounds with professional efficiency and declaring himself satisfied with the healing. Sheriff Reeves stopped by to report that the raiders had fled south and probably wouldn't be back, that the Johnson family was recovering, and that the town council had voted to make Reed's deputy position permanent if he wanted it. "I'll think about it," Reed told him, which was the truth. The shooting had clarified some things, but complicated others. He knew he couldn't go back to being a hired gun, but he wasn't sure he wanted to keep putting himself in danger either. There had to be other ways to earn a living, other skills he could learn that didn't involve violence. After Reeves left, Reed voiced these thoughts to Nora, half expecting her to be relieved that he was considering leaving law enforcement entirely. But she surprised him. "I think you should take the permanent position," she said slowly. "Not because I want you in danger, I don't and I never will. But Reed, you were good out there. The Johnsons are alive because of you. And more than that, I saw how you talked about it afterward, before the shooting. You liked the work, liked feeling useful in a way that helped people instead of hurting them. But you were terrified when I got shot." "Of course I was terrified. I'll be terrified every time you pin on that badge and ride out. But I'd rather be married to a man who's doing work that matters to him than watch you slowly die of boredom and frustration trying to be something you're not." Nora squeezed his hand. "We'll figure out how to live with the fear together. That's what partners do." "You're sure?" "I'm sure that I don't want you making decisions based solely on my fears. Yes, I want you safe, but I also want you whole. And I think being a deputy, helping to protect people who can't protect themselves, that's part of who you are. Maybe the best part." Reed pulled her closer, ignoring the protest from his shoulder, and kissed her forehead. "How did I get so lucky? Finding you, I mean." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Nora said. This was desperation and coincidence and two broken people stumbling into each other at exactly the right moment, but I'll take it over luck any day. The next morning, Reed dressed in clothes Nora had brought from home, his shirt carefully mended where the bullet had torn through, and walked out of the clinic on slightly unsteady legs. The September air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Sweetwater Creek looked different somehow, more real, more permanent. Or maybe Reed was just seeing it with new eyes, the eyes of a man who was planning to stay instead of just passing through. People nodded to him as he walked past, a few calling out greetings or words of thanks. Reed felt exposed, uncomfortable with the attention, but he forced himself to acknowledge it. This was part of having a community, he supposed. Part of being known instead of being a nameless drifter on a nameless horse. The house was exactly as he'd left it, but smaller somehow, more intimate. Nora had been cooking, the smell of bread filled the kitchen, and she'd swept the floors and arranged some wildflowers in a jar on the table. It looked like a home. It looked like his home. "Welcome back," Nora said, appearing in the doorway with Lily on her hip. "The babies and I have been preparing for your return. Well, I've been preparing. They've mostly been making messes and demanding attention." "Sounds about right," Reed said, reaching for Lily. The baby came to him willingly, grabbing his face with sticky hands and babbling something that might have been happiness. "God, I missed you. Missed all of you." "We missed you too," Nora said, and there was something in her voice that made Reed look up. She was blushing slightly, her eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Reed, while you were in the clinic, I had a lot of time to think. About us, about this marriage, about what we're building here." "Okay," Reed said cautiously, not sure where this was going. "I know we agreed this was a practical arrangement, a partnership for the baby's sake. And maybe it started that way, but it's not that anymore. Not for me." Nora took a breath. "I want this to be real, Reed, a real marriage. Not just in name, but in truth. I want to share more than just a house and children with you. I want to share a life." Reed's heart kicked hard against his bruised ribs. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I want to be your wife in every sense of the word. If you want that too. If I haven't completely misread the situation and made a fool of myself." "You haven't misread anything," Reed said quickly, setting Lily down carefully before crossing to Nora. He took her hands in his, feeling the calluses and strength in them. "I want that too. Have wanted it, if I'm being honest, but I didn't think I had the right to ask. Didn't think you'd want someone like me." "Someone like you?" Nora's smile was tremulous. "You mean someone brave and loyal and willing to risk everything to protect strangers? Someone who's gentle with babies and fixes broken doors and is trying so hard to be better than he was? Reed, I'd be lucky to have you fully, to have all of you." Reed kissed her then, properly kissed her, the way he'd wanted to since that night in the line shack when she'd offered to be his partner in this impossible endeavor. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands coming up to frame his face, and Reed felt something slot into place inside his chest, the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Nora laughed. "So that's settled then. We're doing this. Really doing this. Really doing this," Reed agreed. "Though I should probably warn you, I have no idea how to be a proper husband. My first marriage was cut short before I could learn. And I have no idea how to be a proper wife to someone I'm falling in love with instead of just fond of," Nora countered. "So we'll learn together. Make mistakes together. Figure it out as we go." "Falling in love?" Reed echoed, his heart doing something complicated. Nora met his gaze steadily. "Yes. I know it's fast and it's probably foolish, but yes. I'm falling in love with you, Reed Callahan. If that terrifies you, I understand, but I needed you to know." "It does terrify me," Reed admitted, "but it also feels right. Feels like maybe this is what I've been running toward all these years instead of running away from something. And Nora, I'm falling in love with you too. Have been, probably since you took Thomas from my arms and told me I was doing better than I thought." They stood there in their small kitchen, holding each other while Lily played at their feet and Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle, and Reed felt the last of his defenses crumble. This was what it meant to have a family, to have people who knew your worst parts and loved you anyway, to have a reason to wake up tomorrow and the day after that. The next few weeks passed in a haze of domesticity and deepening connection. Reed's shoulder healed slowly, forcing him to stay close to home and learn the rhythms of daily life with 2 infants. He discovered that Thomas had a stubborn streak a mile wide and would fight sleep with surprising determination, while Lily was more easygoing but had developed opinions about food that she expressed with messy enthusiasm. He also discovered that living with Nora as a true wife instead of just a partner changed everything. She'd always been affectionate with the babies, but now that affection extended to Reed. Casual touches as she passed him in the kitchen, her hand on his back when they stood together watching the babies play, the way she'd lean into him when they sat on the porch in the evenings. And at night, when they lay together in their bed, Reed learned the geography of her body and the sounds she made and the way she fit against him like she'd been made for exactly this purpose. "I never thought I'd have this again," he told her one night, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "A home, a family, someone to love who loves me back. I never thought I'd have it at all," Nora replied. "David and I cared for each other, but it wasn't like this. Wasn't this consuming? Is that the right word?" "I don't know, maybe." Reed pulled her closer. "All I know is I wake up every morning grateful that you walked out of those trees beside that creek, that you didn't run when you saw what I was carrying, that you chose to stay." "Where else would I go?" Nora asked simply. "Everything I want is right here." But happiness, Reed was learning, was a fragile thing on the frontier. Just when he thought they'd found their footing, just when the future was starting to look stable and secure, the past came riding back into Sweetwater Creek with trouble in its wake. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the shooting, when Reed was in town picking up supplies. He just left the general store, arms full of packages, when a voice called out behind him, "Reed Callahan, didn't expect to see you in this little nowhere town." Reed froze, recognition hitting him like a fist to the gut. He turned slowly to face a man he hadn't seen in 3 years, Jake Morrison, a fellow gun-for-hire who'd worked some of the same jobs Reed had back when his conscience was quieter and his aims less discriminating. "Jake," Reed said neutrally, setting down his packages carefully. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but the possibility hung in the air between them. "What brings you to Sweetwater Creek?" "You, actually." Jake's smile was cold. "Word's gotten around that you've gone soft. Settled down, got yourself a wife and kids, playing at being respectable. Some of the old crew wanted to see if it was true." "It's true," Reed said carefully. "I'm done with that life, Jake. Done with the killing and the drifting. I've found something better here." "Better?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Reed, you were the best, fastest gun I ever saw. And you're telling me you'd rather play house in this dust trap than make real money?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home. My wife's expecting me." He moved to pick up his packages, but Jake's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Not so fast. See, there's a job, big one, and the boss specifically asked for you. Said no one else could handle it." "Tell your boss I'm not interested." "You sure about that?" "Because the pay is $15,000. That's enough to set you and your little family up for life. Nice house, fancy things, all the security you could want." Reed felt temptation whisper in his ear. 15,000 was more money than he'd ever seen in one place. Enough to expand the house, to set up Nora's clinic properly, to ensure Thomas and Lily never wanted for anything. But he also knew how jobs that paid that much worked, knew the kind of blood required to earn that kind of money. "I said no," Reed repeated firmly, pulling his arm free. "I'm not that man anymore, Jake. Find someone else." Jake's expression hardened. "You don't understand. This isn't an invitation, Reed. It's an obligation. You remember that job in Santa Fe, the one where things went sideways and you left early?" Reed's stomach dropped. He remembered. A railroad baron who'd wanted competition eliminated, a job that had turned into a massacre when it became clear the competition included women and children. Reed had walked away before the killing started, had ridden out of town and sworn he'd never take another job. But he'd taken the advance money, had used it to keep himself alive through a hard winter. "I gave that money back," Reed said, though he knew it was a lie. He'd tried to return it, but by then, the railroad baron was dead and his estate had been scattered. The money was long gone, spent on survival. "That's not how the boss sees it," Jake said. He sees a man who took payment and didn't deliver, and he wants what he's owed. Either you do this job or you pay back the advance plus interest, $20,000. You got that kind of money lying around, Reed? No. Reed felt the world tilting, felt the past reaching out to drag him back under. Jake, I can't. I have a family now, a life. I can't just... You don't have a choice, Jake interrupted. You've got 3 days to decide. Either take the job, pay the money, or... He let the threat hang unfinished. Be a shame if something happened to that pretty wife of yours, or those babies. Awful dangerous, the frontier. Accidents happen all the time. Rage burned through Reed, white hot and consuming. His hand moved toward his gun before he could stop it, but Jake was faster, his own weapon clearing leather first. Don't, Jake warned. I'd hate to have to kill you in the street, make a real mess in front of all these nice people, but I will if you force me. Reed forced his hand away from his gun, forced his breathing to slow. 3 days, he said through clenched teeth. 3 days, Jake confirmed. I'll be at the saloon. Come find me when you've made your decision. He holstered his gun and tipped his hat mockingly. Good seeing you, Reed. Say hello to the family for me. Reed watched him walk away, feeling the weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders like a physical burden. For a moment, he'd thought he could escape it, thought he could become someone new, someone better. But the frontier didn't forgive debts, and it didn't forget sins. And now his family was going to pay the price for his foolish belief in redemption. He gathered his packages mechanically and walked home in a daze. Nora was in the kitchen, Thomas in her arms while Lily played with wooden blocks on the floor. She looked up when he entered, her smile fading immediately when she saw his face. Reed, what's wrong? He set down the packages carefully, then pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. We need to talk. Nora settled Thomas in his cradle and came to sit across from him, her expression shifting from concern to fear. You're scaring me. What happened? So Reed told her. About the Santa Fe job, about the money, about Jake Morrison and the ultimatum. He left nothing out. Not even the parts that made him look terrible, because she deserved the full truth. When he finished, Nora was pale but composed, her hands folded tightly on the table. How much money do we have? She asked quietly. Maybe $300, nowhere near $20,000. And this job he wants you to do? What is it? He didn't say specifically, but jobs that pay $15,000 are never clean. It'll be someone important, someone powerful, and probably a lot of people will die in the process. Nora was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Finally, she looked at him. What do you want to do? I want to tell Jake Morrison to go to hell, Reed said fiercely. I want to protect you and the babies. I want this problem to disappear so we can go back to being a normal family. But I don't know how to make that happen. We could run, Nora suggested. Pack up tonight, head to California or Oregon, start over somewhere they can't find us. They'd find us eventually. Men like Jake, they don't give up. And running means looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives, never feeling safe, never putting down real roots. Is that the life you want for Thomas and Lily? No, Nora admitted. But I don't want you doing this job either. Don't want you becoming that person again, even if it's just once. Reed, you've worked so hard to leave that behind. I know, Reed said miserably, but I don't see another option. There's always another option. Nora reached across and took his hands. We just have to find it, together. They talked long into the night, exploring possibilities and rejecting them, each scenario seeming worse than the last. They could go to Sheriff Reeves, but what could he do against professional gunmen without starting a war in the streets? They could try to raise the money, but even selling everything they owned wouldn't come close. They could refuse and fight, but Reed knew Jake wouldn't be alone. There'd be others, and innocents would die in the crossfire. By dawn, they were no closer to a solution. Reed had slept fitfully, his dreams full of blood and fire and Nora's face when she realized what he'd become again. When he woke, she was already up, feeding the babies with mechanical efficiency, while her mind clearly churned elsewhere. I have an idea, she said without preamble when Reed emerged. You're not going to like it. Try me. We go see Jake Morrison. Together. and we tell him the truth, that you're done with that life, that you have a family now, that you made a mistake in Santa Fe, but you're not the same man anymore. We appeal to whatever humanity he might have left. Reed shook his head. Nora, men like Jake don't have humanity. They have angles and advantages and prices. You can't reason with them. Maybe not, but we have to try. Because the alternative is you either taking this job and losing yourself, or refusing and putting us all in danger. At least if we try talking, we've done everything we can before we resort to violence. And if talking doesn't work, Nora's expression hardened, then we fight, both of us. I didn't survive 2 years alone on the frontier by being helpless, Reed. I can shoot, and I'm not afraid to defend my family. Despite everything, Reed felt a surge of love for this woman, who was willing to stand beside him against his past. You're sure about this? I'm sure I'm not letting you face this alone. We're partners, remember? For better or worse. So that afternoon, leaving the babies with Clara Bennett, who asked no questions but looked worried, Reed and Nora walked into the saloon together. Jake was at a corner table, cards spread before him, and a bottle at his elbow. He looked up when they entered, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Didn't expect you to bring your wife to this conversation, Reed. That's not smart. She insisted, Reed said, pulling out a chair for Nora. And she deserves to hear this. Jake, I'm not doing your job. I'm not paying the debt. Because it's not a legitimate debt. It's extortion based on a job I refuse to finish because it crossed lines even I wouldn't cross. That's not how the boss sees it. I don't care how he sees it, Reed said firmly. I've built a life here, a good life, and I'm not going back to being what I was. Not for $20,000, not for any amount of money. Jake's expression was unreadable. You understand what you're saying? You understand what happens now? I understand you'll threaten my family, try to force me into compliance through fear, but here's what you don't understand, Jake. I'm not afraid anymore. I've got something worth fighting for now, and I'll die before I let you or anyone else take it from me. Bold words. Jake's hand moved toward his gun. Let's see if you can back them up. Don't. Nora's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. She'd produced a small pistol from somewhere. Her reticule, Reed realized. And it was pointed steadily at Jake's chest. I'm not a fast draw like you men, but at this distance I don't need to be. And I promise you, if you threaten my family, I will pull this trigger. For a long moment, Jake just stared at her. Then, incredibly, he laughed. Well, damn. Reed, you picked yourself a hell of a woman. She's got more spine than half the men I've worked with. I know, Reed said, not taking his eyes off Jake's hands. Jake leaned back in his chair, his hand moving away from his gun. All right, I'll take your message back to the boss. Tell him you refused. But Reed, this isn't over. He's not going to just let this go. Then let him come himself, Reed said. Let him come and try to make me do this job. But he'd better come ready to kill me, because I'm not backing down. Fair enough. Jake stood slowly, hands visible. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You were a good partner back in the day. I wish things were different. Things are different, Reed corrected. I'm different. And Jake, if I see you in this town again, if you come anywhere near my family, I won't hesitate. You understand? I understand. Jake tipped his hat to Nora. Ma'am, you take care of him. He's one of the good ones, even if he doesn't always believe it. Then he was gone, walking out of the saloon and leaving Reed and Nora alone with the bartender and a handful of afternoon drinkers who were all studiously pretending they hadn't witnessed the exchange. Reed let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing we've ever done. Probably both, Nora agreed, tucking her pistol away. But Reed, we did it together. We faced down your past together, and we're still standing. For now, Reed said grimly. But Jake was right. This isn't over. His boss won't just let it go. We've bought ourselves time, nothing more. Then we'll use that time, Nora said firmly. We'll prepare. We'll make sure the house is secure, that we have weapons and supplies. We'll talk to Sheriff Reeves, let him know there might be trouble. And we'll keep living our lives, Reed, because if we let fear control us, then they've already won. She was right. Reed knew she was right. But walking home through the afternoon sunshine, knowing that somewhere out there, dangerous men were making plans that involved his family, Reed felt the weight of his past like never before. He thought he could escape it. thought he could become someone new. But maybe some sins were too large to ever be forgiven. Maybe some debts could never be repaid. That night, as they lay in bed with the baby sleeping nearby, Nora curled against him and whispered, "Whatever happens, we face it together. Promise me." "I promise," Reed said, holding her close. "Together." But in the darkness, he made another promise to himself. If it came down to it, if there was no other way to keep his family safe, he would do whatever was necessary, even if it meant becoming the monster he'd worked so hard to leave behind, even if it meant losing himself completely, because some things were worth any price. And the woman in his arms and the children breathing softly in their cradles were worth everything. 3 days passed like 3 lifetimes. Reed walked through each hour with hypervigilance that had served him well in his old life, scanning faces on the street, listening for unusual sounds, his hand never far from his gun. He'd talked to Sheriff Reeves, laying out the situation with brutal honesty, and the older man had promised to keep extra deputies on patrol. But they both knew that if serious trouble came, Sweetwater Creek's small force wouldn't be enough to stop it. Nora moved through those same days with a calm determination that Reed found both admirable and terrifying. She'd hidden weapons throughout the house, a rifle behind the kitchen door, a pistol in the bedroom, another in the drawer where she kept the baby's clothes. She'd stocked extra supplies and water, and she'd taught Reed how to get the babies out through the back window quickly if they needed to run. All of this she did while maintaining her normal routine, seeing patients, caring for Thomas and Lily, cooking meals like the world wasn't potentially about to crash down around them. "You're handling this better than I am," Reed said on the third night, watching her rock Lily to sleep with the same gentle patience she always showed. "I'm not handling it better," Nora corrected quietly. "I'm just better at hiding how terrified I am. Inside Reed, I'm screaming, but Thomas and Lily need us to be calm, to be steady, so that's what I'm being." "I'm sorry," Reed said for what felt like the 100th time. "I'm so damn sorry I brought this into our lives." "Stop apologizing. We've been over this. You made mistakes before we met, yes. But you're not that person anymore, and I refuse to let your past define our future." Nora looked up at him, her eyes fierce in the lamplight. "Whatever happens, Reed, we face it together. That hasn't changed." What happened came on the 4th day just after dawn when the sky was still painted in shades of pink and gold. Reed was outside checking on the horses when he heard the riders coming. Too many horses, moving too fast for a casual morning ride. He dropped the bucket he'd been holding and ran for the house, his heart already hammering. "Nora!" he called, bursting through the door. "Get the babies and get in the back room, now!" She didn't question him, didn't waste time asking why. She just scooped up Thomas and grabbed Lily, moving toward the bedroom with quick efficiency. Reed was checking his weapons when the riders pulled up outside. 5 of them, maybe 6, all armed and moving with the practiced coordination of men who'd done violence together before. The knock on the door was almost polite. Almost. "Reed Callahan," a voice called. "We need to talk." Reed recognized the voice. Not Jake Morrison, but someone older, rougher. Someone who carried authority the way other men carried guns. This would be the boss then, the man Jake had warned him about. "Talk from out there," Reed called back. "You've got no business in my home." "I think I do, considering you owe me $20,000. "I don't owe you anything. The job was dirty, and I walked away. That's not a debt. That's conscience." The man outside laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Conscience? That's rich coming from you, Callahan. I know what you've done, the men you've killed, the lives you've destroyed for money, and now you want to play at being respectable because you've got a wife and some babies? That's not how this works." "Then how does it work?" Reed asked, moving to position himself where he could see out the window without being an easy target. Through the glass, he could see the men spreading out, surrounding the house. Professional, prepared. This was going to get ugly. "It works like this. You do the job I need done, or I burn this house down with your family inside it. Simple economics, Callahan. Your choice." Reed felt ice flood his veins. This was it then. The moment where he had to choose between the man he'd been and the man he wanted to be. Between his family's immediate safety and their long-term survival. Between principles and pragmatism. "Reed," Nora's voice came from the bedroom doorway. She was holding both babies, her face pale, but her expression determined. "Don't do it. Don't become that man again. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Reed said, his voice breaking. "Nora, I can't let them hurt you. Can't let them hurt the babies. If I have to damn myself to keep you safe, that's a price I'll pay." "And then what?" Nora demanded, moving closer despite the danger. "You do this job. You kill whoever they want you to kill, and then there's another job. And another. Because men like him, they never let you go once they have their hooks in you. You'll belong to them forever, Reed. Is that what you want? Is that the father you want to be to Thomas and Lily?" "I want them alive," Reed said desperately. "That's all I want." "Time's up, Callahan," the voice outside called. "What's it going to be?" Reed looked at Nora, at the babies in her arms, at the life they'd built together in this small house with its garden plot and its promise of tomorrow. He thought about the man he'd been when he found Thomas and Lily crying in the ruins of that homestead, and the man he'd become since then. He thought about redemption and second chances and whether some sins were too large to ever be forgiven. And then he thought about his father, about the pocket watch that had stopped a bullet and saved his life, about the inscription on the back that he'd memorized as a boy. Stand for something or fall for anything. Reed Callahan had spent most of his life falling. Maybe it was time to stand. "Here's my answer," he called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You want to burn this house down? You go ahead and try. But know that I'm coming out shooting, and I'm not going to miss. I might die today, but I'm taking as many of you with me as I can. And even if you kill me, my wife is armed and dangerous, and she loves these babies more than she fears death. You'll have to go through both of us. That blood worth $20,000 to you?" The silence outside was absolute. Reed could almost hear the men calculating odds, weighing costs against benefits. He'd made it expensive at least. Made it so that even if they won, they'd lose something in the process. "You're making a mistake, Callahan." "Probably," Reed agreed. "I've made a lot of mistakes, but this isn't one of them. This is me drawing a line and saying you don't cross it. This is me protecting my family. And if that means I die today, then at least I die as someone my children could be proud of." More silence. Then, incredibly, the sound of horses moving, of men mounting up. Reed couldn't believe it, didn't trust it, kept his rifle trained on the door even as the sounds of departure grew fainter. "They're leaving," Nora whispered, disbelief in her voice. "Reed, they're actually leaving." "Maybe," Reed said, not lowering his weapon. "Or maybe they're regrouping. Stay back until I'm sure." He waited 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, listening for any sound of their return. But there was nothing except the morning birds and the wind through the grass and his own hammering heartbeat gradually slowing to something approaching normal. Finally, Sheriff Reeves appeared at the edge of the property, a dozen armed townsmen behind him. "They're gone, Reed. Rode south fast like the devil was chasing them. You all right in there?" Reed lowered his rifle with shaking hands and opened the door. "We're alive. That's more than I expected." "What happened?" Reeves demanded, but there was concern rather than accusation in his voice. So Reed told all of them, about the confrontation and the choice he'd made. When he finished, several of the townsmen were nodding approval, while others looked troubled by the reminder that violence could come so close to their peaceful settlement. "You did right," Reeves said firmly. "Stood your ground, protected your family. That's what a good man does. But Reed, those men might come back. You need to be ready." "I know," Reed said, "and I will be. But Sheriff, I want you to know, I'm done running, done hiding from my past. If they come back, I'll face them. But I'll do it as a deputy of Sweetwater Creek, protecting my home and my town. Not as a hired gun, not as the man I used to be, as the man I'm trying to become." "That's all any of us can do," Reeves said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Try to be better than we were. I'll keep extra men on patrol for a while, just in case. And Reed, welcome home. Officially." After the sheriff and townsmen left, after Reed had checked every corner of the property twice and assured himself the danger had truly passed, he went back inside to find Nora sitting in the rocking chair with both babies, tears streaming silently down her face. "Hey," he said, kneeling beside her. "Hey, it's all right. We're safe. They're gone." "I know," Nora managed. "That's why I'm crying. Reed, I was so sure we were going to die today. Sure, I was going to lose you, but you stood up to them. You chose us. You chose to be the man I fell in love with instead of the man they wanted you to be. There was never really a choice, Reed said, wiping her tears with his thumb. Not once I looked at you and these babies. I'd rather die protecting you than live as someone who'd sold his soul to keep breathing. That's terrifyingly romantic, Nora said with a watery laugh. You do realize that, right? I've been told I'm not great with words, Reed admitted. But I mean them, Nora, everyone. You and Thomas and Lily, you're my second chance, my redemption. And I'm not giving that up for anything or anyone. They held each other there in the morning light, their family complete and safe, and together, and Reed felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't even realized was still unsettled. He'd faced down his past and won. Not with guns or violence, though he'd been prepared for both, but with the simple act of choosing who he wanted to be. The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of relief and residual tension. Nora insisted on maintaining their normal routine, feeding the babies, doing laundry, checking on her patients, as if normalcy itself could ward off any lingering danger. Reed stayed close, hyper-aware of every unusual sound or movement, but nothing materialized. The men who'd come for him that morning didn't return. It wasn't until evening, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the canyon, that Nora finally addressed the elephant neither of them had been willing to name. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. Eventually, Reed considered lying, considered offering false reassurance, but Nora deserved the truth. "I don't know. Maybe. But if they do, we'll handle it the same way we handled today. Together." "I'm tired of living in fear," Nora admitted. "Tired of jumping at shadows and hiding weapons around the house. I want our children to grow up feeling safe, Reed, not constantly looking over their shoulders." "They will," Reed promised, "because we're not going to live in fear. We're going to live our lives, raise these babies, build your clinic, make this house a home. And if trouble comes, we'll face it. But we're not going to let the possibility of trouble stop us from living." "When did you become so wise?" Nora asked with a small smile. "Must have been around the time I met a stubborn midwife by a creek who refused to let me give up on myself," Reed replied. "She's been a good influence." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, Thomas and Lily sleeping peacefully in the cradle Reed had built last week. The night was cool and quiet, full of promise rather than menace, and Reed let himself believe, really believe, that they might actually make this work, that a killer could become a father, that redemption wasn't just a pretty word but an actual possibility. A week passed, then 2, then a month. The men who'd threatened them never returned, and slowly, gradually, the hypervigilance that had gripped Reed began to ease. He accepted the permanent deputy position, working regular hours and coming home each evening to a house that smelled like dinner and sounded like babies. Nora's practice grew as women in town learned to trust her skill and discretion. Thomas learned to roll over and grab his toes. Lily discovered she could make sounds that weren't crying and delighted in practicing them at all hours. Life, in other words, became normal. Blessedly, wonderfully, impossibly normal. "I can't believe it's been almost 3 months," Nora said one evening as they prepared for bed, "since we found each other by that creek, since this whole crazy journey started." "Feels like longer," Reed said, pulling off his boots. "Feels like I've always known you." "That's either very romantic or very concerning," Nora teased. "I haven't decided which." "Can it be both?" "With you, it usually is." She came to sit beside him on the bed, her hand finding his. "Reed, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." "All right," Reed said cautiously. "Are you happy? Really happy? Because I know this life, domesticity and babies and being tied down, it's not what you chose originally. It's what circumstances forced on you. And I need to know if you resent it. Resent us." Reed turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Nora Avery Callahan, I have never been happier in my entire life. And yes, maybe circumstances forced us together initially, but I choose this every single day. I choose you. I choose Thomas and Lily. I choose this house and this town and this life we're building. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because this is everything I never knew I needed." You're sure? I'm sure, Reed said firmly. Are you happy? Because I know you signed up to help with 2 orphaned babies, not to marry a man with a dangerous past and questionable prospects. I'm happier than I ever imagined I could be, Nora said. David was a good man, and I cared for him. But Reed, what we have, it's different. It's deeper. It's the kind of love that poets write about, and I never believed actually existed. We're quite a pair, Reed said with a soft laugh. 2 broken people who stumbled into each other at exactly the right moment and somehow made something beautiful out of all our broken pieces. The best things are made from broken pieces, Nora replied. They're stronger for having been shattered and rebuilt. They made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of deep connection rather than just physical need, and afterward, lying tangled together while the babies slept nearby, Reed felt a peace he'd never experienced before. This was home. This was family. This was everything that mattered. The following weeks brought new developments. Dr. Morrison helped Nora expand the clinic, adding a proper examination room and supplies that would let her handle more complex cases. Reed worked with a local carpenter to build a proper nursery for Thomas and Lily, complete with individual cradles that he'd carved with patient care. The garden Nora had planned began to take shape, with vegetables sprouting in neat rows and flowers along the fence. They fell into rhythms that felt ancient and comfortable. Reed leaving for his patrol in the morning with a kiss goodbye, Nora waving from the porch with babies on her hips. Dinner together every evening, talking about their days while Thomas and Lily provided chaotic commentary from their high chairs. Nights spent reading by lamplight or sitting on the porch watching stars. The future spreading before them like the desert, vast and full of possibility. People in town have stopped looking at us strangely, Nora observed one Sunday after church. We're just part of the community now, the deputy and his family. Took them long enough, Reed said, but he was smiling. Integration had been harder than he'd expected. Small towns were slow to trust outsiders, especially outsiders with guns and secrets. But patience and consistent behavior had won out eventually. Mrs. Bennett said something interesting today, Nora continued as they walked home. She said she'd never seen someone change as completely as you have. Said most men are who they are and no amount of good intention changes that. But you're different. I had good motivation, Reed said, adjusting Thomas on his shoulder, and a good teacher. You showed me what was possible, Nora. Showed me that the past doesn't have to define the future. We showed each other that, Nora corrected. I was just as stuck as you were, Reed. Just as certain that my life was over after David died. You gave me a reason to start living again. As autumn deepened into winter, Sweetwater Creek transformed. The creek itself ran fuller with seasonal rains, and the surrounding landscape turned from brown to green. Thomas learned to sit up on his own, his serious little face breaking into rare smiles when Reed made funny sounds. Lily became more mobile, rolling and scooting until Nora declared they needed to rethink their entire house layout before she learned to crawl properly. They're growing so fast, Nora said one evening, watching the babies play on a blanket. Sometimes I look at them and can barely remember those first few days when we weren't sure they'd survive. They're survivors, Reed said. They come by it honestly. Their real mother died protecting them. That's strength that runs deep. Do you think we should tell them? Nora asked quietly. Eventually, I mean, about how they came to us, about their birth parents. Reed had thought about this question many times, had no easy answer. I think we have to. They deserve to know where they came from, but not yet. Not until they're old enough to understand that love comes in different forms, and family is about choice as much as blood. When you became a father, you also became a philosopher, Nora teased gently. When I became a father, I became someone who thinks before he acts, Reed corrected. That's philosophy adjacent at best. Winter brought its own challenges and joys. The house stayed warm thanks to Reed's diligent woodcutting and the efficient fireplace. Snow fell occasionally, transforming Sweetwater Creek into something almost magical. Reed taught Thomas to feel snowflakes on his face, laughing at the baby's expression of confused wonder. Lily tasted snow and decided it was acceptable, but not as good as the mashed carrots Nora made. Christmas arrived with unexpected celebration. The community put on a modest festival in the church, and Reed found himself playing fiddle, a skill from his youth he'd almost forgotten, while children danced and adults sang carols. Nora watched from the side, both babies in her lap, her expression so full of love and contentment that Reed's throat tightened with emotion. "This is what I wanted to give you," he told her later, after they'd returned home and put the babies to bed. "Belonging, community, a life that's about more than just survival." "You've given me that and so much more," Nora replied, kissing him softly. "You've given me everything I thought I'd lost: purpose, family, love that doesn't come with conditions or expectations. Reed, you've given me hope." Spring came with its promise of renewal, and with it came news that made the whole town buzz with excitement. Sweetwater Creek was growing, attracting more families, more businesses. There was talk of building a proper school, of expanding the church, of all the markers of civilization pushing back against the wilderness. "We're part of something," Reed marveled one evening, watching as merchants erected a new store across from the general store. "Something that's going to last, that's going to be here long after we're gone. And Thomas and Lily will grow up in a real town instead of a frontier outpost," Nora added. "They'll have opportunities we never did, education, options, futures that don't depend on how fast they can draw a gun or how much they can endure." "Is that what you want for them?" Reed asked. "A safe, conventional life?" "I want them to have choices," Nora said firmly. "To be able to choose safety if they want it, or adventure if that calls to them. But I want those choices to be theirs, not forced on them by circumstance or survival." The babies chose that moment to wake from their nap, filling the house with demanding cries for attention. Reed and Nora moved in practiced unison to tend them, a dance they'd perfected over months of repetition. Thomas needed changing, Lily needed feeding, both needed the simple reassurance of parental presence. As Reed held Thomas, the boy's small hand gripping his finger with surprising strength, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that blood-soaked homestead to this peaceful house, from a lone drifter to a husband and father, from killing for money to protecting a community. The distance was vast, almost unbelievable. "What are you thinking about?" Nora asked, catching his expression. "About how far we've come," Reed admitted, "and how close I came to never having this. If I'd been an hour earlier or later at that homestead, if you hadn't been by that creek, if I'd made different choices at any of a dozen points, this all could have never happened." "But it did happen," Nora said. "We found each other exactly when we needed to. That's not luck, Reed. That's something bigger. Call it fate or providence or just the universe finally giving us both a break. Whatever it is, I'm grateful for it every single day." "Me too," Reed said quietly. "More than I can ever express." Summer arrived hot and bright, bringing with it Thomas's first birthday. Nora organized a small celebration with neighbors and friends, and Reed found himself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his family's happiness. Sheriff Reeves gave Thomas a wooden horse he'd carved himself. Dr. Morrison presented Lily with a soft doll. Clara Bennett brought a cake that made both babies sticky and delighted. "Look at this," Nora said later, after everyone had left and they were cleaning up the cheerful mess. "A year ago, we didn't even know these babies existed, didn't know each other. And now we have all of this: friends, community, a home full of love and laughter. How did we get so lucky?" "I don't think it was luck," Reed said, echoing her earlier words. "I think it was two people who were willing to take a chance on each other and on themselves. Who were willing to believe that redemption was possible even when everything argued against it." "You've become quite the romantic," Nora observed. "What happened to the taciturn gunslinger who could barely string 3 words together?" "He found something worth talking about," Reed replied, pulling her close. "Found someone worth opening up to. You changed me, Nora. Made me into someone better." "We changed each other," Nora corrected. "That's how the best relationships work, both people becoming more than they were because they found each other." As the evening settled into comfortable domesticity, babies bathed and put to bed, dishes washed and put away, house tidied for tomorrow, Reed stood on their back porch and looked out at the garden Nora had cultivated. Vegetables growing in abundance, flowers blooming despite the desert heat, life thriving where once there'd been only bare earth. It was a metaphor, Reed realized. This whole journey had been about cultivating life where there'd been only barrenness, about believing that growth was possible even in the harshest conditions, about having the courage to plant seeds and trust they'd grow. Reed, Nora's voice called from inside. Are you coming to bed? In a minute, he replied, just thinking. About what? About promises kept and lives saved. About second chances and the woman who made them possible. About two babies who survived the impossible and gave me a reason to try to do the same. Nora appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. We all saved each other, she said softly. That's the real miracle here. Not that the babies survived, though that's miracle enough, but that four people who could have been lost found each other and made something beautiful. They stood there in the gathering darkness, watching stars emerge one by one, and Reed felt complete in a way he'd never experienced before. The past was behind him, not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer defining his present or his future. The man who'd killed for money was gone, replaced by a man who lived for love. I love you, he said, the words coming easier now after months of practice. I love our life. I love who I am when I'm with you. I love you too, Nora replied. Love the family we've built from broken pieces and desperate circumstances. Love that we proved everyone wrong who said people can't change, can't become better than they were. They can if they have the right motivation, Reed said, and if they're willing to do the work. Change isn't easy, Nora. Some days I still catch myself reaching for the man I used to be, especially when things get difficult. But you don't become him, Nora pointed out. You reach for him, but you don't grasp. That's the difference between trying and succeeding. I succeed because of you, because disappointing you is worse than any other fear. Don't put that on me, Nora said, but gently. You succeed because you want to, because you've decided the man you want to be is more important than the man you were. I support you in that, love you through it, but the choice and the work, that's all you, Reed. They went inside eventually, checking on the babies one final time before retiring to their own bed. Thomas was sleeping with his thumb in his mouth, peaceful and secure. Lily had kicked off her blanket again, and Reed carefully tucked it back around her before pressing a kiss to her forehead. Our children, he whispered, the possessive pronoun still feeling miraculous on his tongue. Our family. Our second chance, Nora added, taking his hand. Our proof that love can bloom even in the desert. That families can be made, not just born. That the past doesn't have to determine the future. As they lay together in the darkness, Reed thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first moment when desperate infant cries had pierced through his isolation, to the creek where a stranger had offered help without judgment, to this bed where he now lay beside a woman who knew his worst parts and loved him anyway. Some might call it fate. Others might call it coincidence. Reed preferred to think of it as grace, unearned, undeserved, but gratefully received. He'd been given a gift he never could have earned through any effort of his own, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of it every single day for the rest of his life. What are you thinking about now? Nora asked sleepily. About promises kept, Reed replied. Standing in those ruins, I promised Thomas and Lily they'd make it, that I'd keep them alive no matter what. And I did. We did. We did more than that, Nora said. We gave them a home, gave each other a home. That's worth more than mere survival. It's worth everything, Reed agreed. He lay awake for a while longer after Nora's breathing deepened into sleep, thinking about the man he'd been and the man he'd become. The transformation hadn't been easy or smooth. He still had nightmares sometimes about the men he'd killed, still caught himself reaching for weapons that weren't there when he heard unexpected sounds. But those moments were becoming rarer, replaced by memories of babies laughing and Nora's smile and ordinary domestic moments that somehow felt more precious than any amount of gold. Dawn found Reed already awake, watching light creep across the ceiling and listening to his family breathe. Thomas made small sounds in his sleep, probably dreaming about whatever babies dreamed about. Lily snored softly, a trait she'd inherited from no one Reed could identify. Nora slept with one hand stretched toward him, even in sleep seeking connection. This was it, Reed thought. This was what redemption looked like. Not dramatic or flashy, but quiet and domestic and real. It was choosing to get up every morning and be better than yesterday. It was loving people more than you feared losing them. It was building something that would outlast you and trusting that the foundation you laid would be strong enough to support whatever came after. The babies woke with their usual morning demands, and Reed rose to tend them while Nora slept a few minutes longer. He changed diapers with practiced efficiency, warmed milk, and settled both babies in his lap while they ate. Thomas grabbed Reed's finger the way he always did, and Lily kicked her feet in contentment, and Reed felt his heart swell with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Your mama's still sleeping," he told them quietly, "so it's just us for a bit. Want to know a secret? A year ago, I didn't know you existed. Didn't know your mama existed. I was alone and angry and pretty sure my life was over. And then I found you crying in the ruins, and everything changed. You saved me, you know that? Saved me from becoming something I wouldn't have been able to live with. Gave me a reason to be better." Thomas made a sound that might have been agreement. Lily just kept eating, unconcerned with philosophical discussions. "So I'm going to make you another promise," Reed continued. "I promise to be the father you deserve, to teach you right from wrong, to keep you safe without making you afraid, to show you that people can change if they want to badly enough. I promise to love your mama with everything I have, because she gave me all of this. And I promise that no matter what comes, no matter what challenges we face, we'll face them together as a family. That's what families do. They stand together." "That's a good promise," Nora said from the doorway, her voice rough with sleep and emotion. "I'm holding you to it." "I intend to keep it," Reed said, "every day for the rest of my life." She came to sit beside him, completing their small circle, and for a moment they just existed in the morning light. 2 adults and 2 babies, a family forged from tragedy and circumstance but strengthened by choice and love. Outside, Sweetwater Creek was waking up, the sounds of civilization replacing the silence of the frontier. Inside, Reed Callahan held his family close and felt, for the first time in his life, truly at peace. The past was behind him. The future was uncertain, as futures always were. But the present was everything he'd never dared to hope for, and he was going to cherish every single moment of it. "Thank you," he said to Nora, to the babies, to whatever force had brought them all together. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running, for teaching me that home isn't a place, it's people. That family isn't just blood, it's choice. That redemption isn't something you receive, it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice, until you become someone who deserves the love they've been given." "You already deserved it," Nora said, kissing his temple. "You just needed to believe it." And there, in that small house in Sweetwater Creek, with the New Mexico sun streaming through the windows and his family safe in his arms, Reed Callahan finally did.